So hello, everyone. I'm pleased today to have with me Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke, people that most of you, many of you, not all of you, will be familiar with. I've been working on a new book entitled We Who Wrestle with God, and it's been influenced by Jonathan's ideas and John's ideas. And I developed an argument in part as a consequence of the public lectures I've been doing for the last 3 months, trying to push my ideas farther. And I put forward a set of propositions that I'm basing one of the book chapters on. I wrote it as an outline, and then I think it's solid. I've been testing it when I've been speaking at universities as well to diverse audiences of specialists to see if they'll object to it, because I think it's actually quite radical. And I sent this group of propositions, or this list of propositions, to Jonathan and John a month ago and we've been going back and forth. And I heard Jonathan was coming to town to do a talk with John. And I thought, hey, that's a good opportunity. We could get together and walk through these propositions, because I'd like to see if they're solid, because if they're solid, well, that's good. And if they're not, I'd like to find out. And so we're going to do this a little different. This is going to be a little different than many of the conversations I've had, because it'll have a bit more structure. And I want to read the propositions. There's, I think, about 15 of them. And I want Jonathan and John to comment on them, to tell me where they agree, to tell me where they disagree, to tell me what they don't understand, and to see if I can, learn something as a consequence. That's kind of the hope. And so we'll start with this first proposition. To see the world, we must prioritize our perceptions. So, John, I'll ask you about that first, because that's I believe, a particular focus of yours. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
No, it's not. That's the core of my work. And so the main way I would respond to this is I would say, I think the work that's coming out from artificial intelligence and the work that's coming out from attention lines up with this very well. I don't have any significant disagreement with that proposition.
And the must part of it as well?
So the must, let me tell you how I took the must. Yeah. And I took it as what's called constitutive necessity. I took it to be, if you're going to be a cognitive agent, then you must do this. I didn't take it to be a metaphysical necessity. I took it to be that kind of constitutive necessity.
I think it's useful to start with what you describe as constituent necessities before you move into the realm of metaphysical necessity.
I think that's a good way to argue. You should, right? And so I think, and I'm not going to recapitulate all these arguments, but a lot of work, I think, zeroes in on the idea that the core of what makes us intelligent, and the thing that we're finding difficult to give to machines to make them artificially general intelligence, is a process I call relevance realization, which is exactly, I think, lines up with this very well. The amount of information available to you in the world is astronomically vast. All the things you could pay attention to. The amount of information in your long-term memory, especially if you think of all the ways it could be combined, is also astronomically vast. Right. The number of options of potential lines of behavior. I could move this finger or this finger. I could move them. I could live and the ways I can move around.
That's combinatorial explosion.
All of it. And then, right. And then you can also consider, all of the options, of different, of potential worlds you might want to consider trying to produce or moving into, right? And so the point is, in many different dimensions, we face combinatorial explosion. And what you can't do, and this is where it lines up with the must, because we're finite beings with finite resources and finite time, is you can't check all of that information. So you can't go and say, no, that's not relevant. That's not relevant. That memory is not relevant. That will take, right? That's the rest of the history of the universe.
Right. So we don't know how we do it, in fact, because of that, in part.
Well, I mean, I think there's getting some clues towards it. But we can talk about that later. Okay. Right.
So the must and the prioritization on the perception side, you're fine with.
It has to be. And here's the tricky thing, which is, the fact that we can't check it means, and this sounds almost like a Zen koan, is the prioritization is odd when you say it sort of like prima facie.
Yeah.
Because it means we intelligently ignore most of the information.
Right.
So the prioritization, what I want to put.
That's a good codicil. So you're saying that you don't want to misinterpret the necessity for prioritization as something like the necessity or our ability to make a numbered list of the number of possibilities that lay out in front of us, because that's actually impossible.
Right. So
that isn't how we do it. However we do it, isn't that?
Exactly. So if you're okay with that reading, and it sounds like you are, prioritization doesn't mean what we normally mean by prioritization, where we set things out explicit and focal and then choose between them.
It's implicit.
It's implicit and it's self-organizing, and our ability to think.
And it's unconscious.
Yes, emerges out of it. We can influence it top down, but because it is an absolute requirement for our cognition, I would argue that our ability to do anything that we do consciously is ultimately dependent on it and presupposes it.
Right. Okay, fine. So that's good. Jonathan, you got anything to add to that?
I think the only thing that I would add is you have to phrase it in a certain way. You have to have a sentence. But there's a sense in which perception, when we say we must prioritize our perceptions, I think the best way to understand it is that perception is already prioritization. In order to perceive, there has to be a hierarchy in itself.
Perception is in and of itself an act of implicit prioritization.
And to use the word implicit would be a good idea. So to avoid the idea that we are consciously doing it, but that in order to even perceive the world, there already has to be a given hierarchy that is making you able to focus on anything. Because or else we would be lost in a wave, a sea of infinite details.
Okay, so I think that's a good codicil. And so we could also make a little technical case here quickly. So part of the problem that John referred to is that, in some sense, it's the problem of the finite confronting the infinite. And so we could make a neurological argument for that. So, for example, when you move your eyes around, or when they move around as a consequence of being directed by unconscious structures of prioritization, because that happens all the time, you move your eyes around because you want to direct the high resolution part of your visual system to whatever you're attending to. That's the fovea. And the fovea is a very small part of your retina, and it's a very high resolution part. So each cell in the fovea is connected at the level of the primary visual cortex to 10,000 cells. And then each of those have 10,000 connections. And so if your whole vision was foveal in its resolution, you'd have to have a skull like an alien to contain that much brain. And so, and that's a real indication of that finitude, right? Is that you do have limited cognitive resources, and limited means practically and physically limited, but it also means metabolically limited. The cost of running your brain is already extremely high. And so you're going to shepherd your available attentional resources because they are finite, and they're finite in no small part because they are technically, metabolically costly. That all seems okay?
So I would add one thing to that, which is I would put an emphasis on how this process has to be self-organizing, because we want to avoid a perennial problem, which you and I both know shows up in psychology, which is to posit the internal homunculus that actually doesn't explain the problem, but just shifts it. The central executive is an example of this, etc. So we don't want to say that there's someone that's doing the prioritization, because that someone
is just as mysterious.
Right. And is facing the very problem that we're trying to explain. So, the process has to be dynamically self-organized.
One of the ways I've realized how that problem works is in an attempt to solve the mind-body problem, because you can't solve the mind-body problem. But you can say, let's say you want to explore an idea, and you decide to do that by writing an essay. So then you sit down in front of the computer, which is not an idea. It's actually that you're sitting, and then you move your fingers on the keyboard. And so there's a hierarchy of transformation from mind, which might be the abstract intent, to body. And so the spirit hits the body in the finger movements. And then the spirit disappears in some sense under the finger movements, because you can move your fingers voluntarily, but you have no idea what muscles you're moving to do that. And you can't control the cells or anything like that.
Oh, I did that with my students in the lecture this morning. I was talking about this very fact that I said, put up your finger. Okay. Bend your finger. What do you do to bend your finger?
Right.
Bend
Exactly.
finger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting that you have that level of consciousness at that level of detail, which is pretty detailed, but no more than that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a mystery, man. That localization of consciousness between the body and part of the spirit. There's like a, what would you call it? There's a bandwidth. There's a bandwidth of resolution for consciousness.
Yes.
And why that see, the social psychologists who studied language sort of cottoned on to this, because one of the things they realized was that short words, first of all, short words tend to be old words.
Yes.
So, because as language develops, words that are used a lot get more efficient. But the short words also map extraordinarily well onto the self-evident level of perception. And so, for example, a short word is cat, because a cat presents itself for some reason to our perception. The species cat doesn't, and the fur of the cat in some sense doesn't. It's the cat.
Yes.
And you can see that primary object level recognition.
Basic level.
Basic
Rush.
level. That's right.
Rush.
Yes.
Level.
Yes. And so you see that with babies, because they get doggy pretty damn fast. And that's because the language maps onto the primary domain of perception, that basic level perception, quite nicely. And that is associated with something like the natural bandwidth of consciousness.
Yeah. I would say that lines up with, if Rush's explanation is, you're getting the best trade-off between differences between category and similarities within categories.
Right. And then the question is, what does best trade-off mean?
Exactly. And and for me, that'd be a little bit of, I guess, a nuance I'd want to put onto the prioritization, because the prioritization sounds very much sort of like an imposition. Whereas I think what we're talking about is something more like what Merleau-Ponty talked about when he talked about optimal gripping,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Yeah,
what's the correct, distance to look at this? Well, it depends, because if I zoom in, I lose the gestalt. If I zoom out, I lose the detail.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do.
Exactly.
Yes, well,
Exactly.
that's it. That's why I'm kind of attracted to pragmatism. It's like, well, to some degree, our theories of truth need to be embedded in the practicalities of action. And so, is that a grippable object that I can drink from? Well, I want my perception to match that problem.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I think that if you understand that the prioritization, let's say that you have heaven and earth, I'm going to use mythical categories, but so you have,
that's fine.
you have heaven and earth, and that it's the way in which heaven meets earth is a mutual relationship, right? We always see it as a relationship of lovers, you could say. So it's not, the prioritization isn't just about an imposition from above, but it's about the manner in which that which is above, let's say the hierarchy, is able to encounter the potential in which it's...
We were talking about that last night. So Jonathan made this funny joke last night. We were talking about Sam Harris, and Sam Harris has this line of argumentation where, and he used this on me, where I interpreted a biblical story and then he interpreted a recipe.
Yes.
And he said, well, look at all the interpretations. And that is a problem of
semiotic drift. Yes.
Well, it's also a problem of this horizon of infinite possibility. There are multiple interpretive schemes.
Yes.
So Jonathan said he'd like to do a video where he shows that a recipe is actually necessarily embedded inside a mythological framework. And we started to talk about that, because imagine, well, the recipe implies that you need to make an edible meal, that you want to make an edible meal, that you're going to serve it to family and friends, that's part of a kind of communion, that you think that's a good thing, that's worth spending time on, that serves your family and friends, that's maybe nested in something like an ethic of service to the community. Like there's a whole network of purpose.
I would add more to that. There's all kinds of implicit assumptions that I can capture in a sequence of propositions, procedural skills that are not completely capturable in words, and that those procedures and skills can also map on to the particular virtues and skill, that people are bringing to it. Like, it's like most things can't be solved by a recipe. And yet, so a recipe is a significant cognitive cultural achievement, and we don't recognize and we tend to overgeneralize the things we think for which we can provide recipes. This is one of the,
That's an algorithm issue.
Yes, exactly. And so there's lots. Yeah.
But even in the recipe itself, you will notice that the way in which we name things and the way in which we order things will be related to a normal prioritization, hierarchy prioritization. But if you're making chicken, you'll have the chicken and then you'll have the spices, and you'll understand that these elements that I'm adding are spices, and that they're, let's say, something like a marginalia that I'm adding to the central meal. Yeah. It's actually it's the pattern of a church, actually, where you have a movement towards the central identity that we understand, and then we have the way in which it's complemented through other things. And so even the actual recipe itself is like a little microcosm.
And also the judgment you use is like, well, how much spice? Yeah. Well, the answer is, well, what function is the spice going to serve? And you say, well, I want to add a little zest and interest to my cooking. And so then you have a philosophy of zest and interest that's associated with that, because just predictable chicken isn't good enough. And maybe you want to put a little more spice on because you want to, what would you say? You want to challenge your guests a little bit in an interesting way. And you're thinking this all through. And
for the same reason you'd wear funny socks or a tie that has just a little bit too much on it,
Mm-hmm. Well, it's same thing. I mean, that's actually a feature of general problem solving. Like when people are solving a problem, especially if they might get the wrong frame, moderately distracting you from the central concern is an optimal way to
exactly. You need to do that.
So what I'm hearing both of you say is the prioritization is really a multi-dimensional optimal gripping.
That's right.
We're constantly trading off.
Okay. Well, then we can also expand on that to some degree, because multi-dimensional and optimal brings a lot of other concerns into it. So imagine that one of the principles, and Kant moved towards this with his theory of universal ethic in some sense, although I think I hesitate to criticize Kant, but I think that there's a deeper explanation for what he observed is, well, how should I treat you? Well, that's a complex question. But one of the constraints is, well, what if we meet 100 times? So we're going to establish an actual relationship. So however I conduct myself in the present moment has to be in accordance with a value hierarchy that takes into account the desirability of our mutual interrelationship into the future. Mm-hmm. And that produces a very serious series of, I would say, often intrinsic constraints. So I can't be too insulting. I can't be too unwelcoming. I have to offer you something approximating a true reciprocity for the thing not to degenerate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And all of that, and I would say that also governs how you cook for someone if you actually want to make friends. So it's like treat other people as you would like them to treat you. Yeah. And it's pretty funny that that's the intrinsic ethic in a recipe. And so that's such a funny argument.
We'll get right back to Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke in just a moment. First, we'd like to tell you about Elysium Health. Founded by Dr. Leonard Guarente, a renowned MIT researcher and 30-year student of the science of aging, Elysium Health is on a mission to translate critical scientific advancements in aging research into accessible health products and technologies. Their flagship product, Basis, replenishes youthful levels of NAD+, activating what scientists call our longevity genes to promote healthy aging and keep you feeling younger, longer. Many customers report benefits such as sustained, maintained energy levels, less general tiredness and fatigue, more satisfying workouts and support in recovery from workouts, healthy skin, and general health and wellness. Matter, Elysium's brain aging supplement, was developed in partnership with the University of Oxford. Matter does what no other product does. It slows the shrinking of our brains. For most of us, brain shrinkage begins in our 30s and impacts memory, learning, and even physical activity. Lifestyle factors such as alcohol consumption, smoking, and poor sleep habits accelerate this process. Matter is patented and clinically proven to slow the age-related loss in the brain's memory centers by an average of 86%. Many Matter customers have reported improvements in memory and cognition. Go to explorematter.com/Jordan and enter code JBP10 at checkout to save 10% off Matter prepaid subscriptions, as well as other Elysium Health supplements.
Okay, so let's move to the second presupposition. To act in the world, so it's kind of a corollary of the first or something equivalent. To act in the world, we must prioritize our actions. I don't think we probably have to cover that, right? Because it's perception is an action already, because you have to move your eyes and orient your head. And
optimal gripping is an action.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So I think that goes with it. Right?
Yeah, okay. So we'll leave that. Okay. Now this is a nice switch, I think. Any system of priorities is a structure of values. And then I sneak something in, an ethic. So I'm kind of defining ethic as a something approximating perhaps an internally, it's like a game. It's an internally consistent hierarchy of value, but it's going to have to be iterable in the sense that we already discussed. So that's kind of what I'm defining an ethic as. And then you could also think of it as something that's embodied. So when you're watching someone on a screen in a movie, say a character, they embody an ethic. That's what makes them interesting. It's a whole structure of value, and they're acting it out. And it's a system of priorities of perception and action. And that's a value structure. The reason it's a value structure is because, well, what's the difference between prioritization and value? You prioritize what you value. And so
I think the difficulty I have is if you use the word ethic, because the word ethic is so charged with morality and also to the way that we're supposed to act between each other, then I think it can be a little bit misleading because value is great.
It implies good.
It seems to, well, I think good is fine. That is the good in the sense that there's also a good glass, which has no moral bearing at all. There's a good way to walk down the hall, which is not a moral question. There's there's a good way to fish, but these are not ethical.
Well, maybe they are.
Maybe. But I think that's maybe the little place where I would wonder about.
Yeah, so that's a terminological problem in some sense, right? Well, it is.
I don't know. What do you think that it seems to, as the word ethic seems to imply interpersonal relationships more.
Yeah, the word ethic has been reduced to the moral interactions.
Ethical.
Yes. Whereas typically philosophers will use the term normativity to be a much more general term for the idea that there's a governing principle for your behavior.
Okay, so I'll have to make sure I clarify that when I read about this. But I was also thinking about, common fictional tropes in popular culture. So if you're watching a mafia movie, one of the things that's interesting about a mafia criminal, as opposed to just your ordinary criminal, is that he's not entirely chaotic, right? He abides by the mafia code. So he's loyal to
the certain code.
Yeah, he's loyal to a code. So it makes him a quasi-ethic actor. And I would say, well, the mafia character does embody an ethic. And I'm kind of struggling for a word that isn't ethic. You might disagree with the ethic.
No, but I think it's because, I think you can actually take this a lot further than just a mafia person. I think there's a way that you can be a good mass murderer. That in the sense that you have discovered the hierarchy of values, things you need to value in order to become a good mass murderer. And now you're engaging in them towards that hierarchy of values. There is you could say there are satanic hierarchies,
the Columbine killers, for example, were doing exactly that. And most of the mass shooters, there's a contest going on. Yeah. They know about each other. They're often, in fact, one kid who was planning to do this wrote me.
Really?
6 months ago, he had a 50-page manifesto ready and the weapons. And he watched this YouTube video discussion I did with Warren Farrell and where we touched on this issue. And he decided that there was seriously something wrong with him and that he should get some help and not do this. But he was in contact with one of the people who went out and shot up a high school. They had been contact online. So he was that far away from it. Yeah, but so there is this. It's not you can have a chaotic criminal who's completely unpredictable, but then you don't have much of a plot, right? He's not an interesting character.
He's going to get caught really fast.
Well, there's that too, right? The far more interesting ones have an ethic. Now, it's not an ethical ethic.
Right. So that's why the word ethic is difficult, because you could say that ultimately what's going to happen is that there will be a hierarchy of value systems that will be more related to the good in the classical sense. That is
Plato.
Exactly.
And this is Plato's argument that nobody willingly does evil. Everybody does what they conceive to be a good in some fashion.
Yeah, and you see that in Dante. You see the same. His whole movement. He even talks about how the people in hell, everybody is there because of.
I'm reading the Divine Comedy right now.
That's wonderful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great. Mm-hmm. Everybody who is there because of love for a good, even if they love the good too much or they're mistaken about, let's say, the actual ultimate value of that good. Everybody moves towards a good, even if you're doing something which is completely reprehensible.
Yeah, the proposal that sin is actually failing to love wisely.
Yeah,
exactly. That's the Dante.
You see that
I have some problem with that viewpoint because I think that happens. I do think that happens. And I think many of the, I've talked to people like my friend Greg Hurwitz, who writes thrillers, and he crafts pretty evil characters. And we've talked about that a lot. An evil character with an ethic, so like a misplaced love, is a very interesting character. But then there's the other sorts of characters that are more Cain-like, because Cain his spirit, the spirit that's expressed in that story, he isn't aiming at something that's good. He's aiming at getting away with lying to God. He's aiming at getting away with making insufficient sacrifices. He's aiming at getting away eventually with murder. It's not a perversion of the good. And I think that we underestimate the problem of evil if we assume that it's merely a consequence of worshiping false idols, say. Because the idol can be it's like I talked to you last night about the reports that Michel Foucault raped boys in graveyards. It's like, okay, he argued even formally, culturally, to abolish or at least radically reduce the age of consent. And a lot of intellectuals went along with him. And maybe you can have a discussion about that and what the age of consent could be. And maybe you can't. There's room for differences in opinion there. But when your pedophilia involves graveyard sex, then that's not a misplaced good. Like that's.
But why not, Jordan? Why isn't that pleasure is a good, right? And
well, it's so specific. Why the graveyard? Like there's something so dark. I think that's a place that's so dark that you can't go there without knowing that it's dark. And I really do believe, and I've done my best to study the thought of people who've done truly reprehensible things, is that there's a level of reprehensibility where you are going there to cause the most trouble you can. And I don't see if there's any good left in that. It's such a tiny
I'm really
spark.
going to be the devil's advocate here, knowing that there are some that do it better than others and some that don't do it as well. Even recognizing that the good that they're aiming towards is not really transcendentally
their
the good.
memory has to be working. Their problem solving has to be working.
So they're still driven by a coherent spirit.
That's right.
Well, that's what I think the spirit of Lucifer and the spirit of Goethe's Mephistopheles. That's and the spirit of Cain. That's a description of that ethic. It is a coherent personality. Yeah. And that's why there's so much, and Milton as well. There's been an attempt to delineate the ethic of evil. Yeah. And it's not merely chaotic.
And one of the reasons why it's important, and maybe it's hard to see that right away, but one of the reasons why it's important, at least I find it important to formulate it this way, the way that Dante formulated it or that Plato formulated it, is that if you don't go in this direction, you end up with a dualism, and then they end up acting as like two opposites. Whereas there's the more Platonic way of setting it up, what ends up happening is that the evil always ends up just being a perversion of the good.
Right.
And
it's parasitic.
It's always parasitic. And so what it does is that it makes the good truly good, and it makes it all pervasive in a way in which it can actually fill up the entire cosmos. This idea that even in the depth of hell, the love of God is there. Like you see that in a lot of the Christian mystics, that there is no place that is
okay. So let me ask you about that on the grounds of Christian theology. So, and I'm probably going to mangle this, and so correct me. Well, there's an idea that in the book of Revelation that Christ is the eternal judge, but that he's also a judge who comes back at the end of days and separates the wheat from the chaff, the damned from the saved. And the implication in that book is that many are called, but few are chosen. The judgment's pretty damn harsh. And most spirits are damned. Most people are damned. And then is that eternal, or is there a reconciliation? And so I don't know the answer to that. So in the Christian theological
you could say
sense.
That the best way, this is the type of thing that could actually get me in trouble, but it's like the best way to formulate it, I think, that we're seeing in the Orthodox tradition right now, is to say that we live in the hope of a final restoration. But that we cannot
the universal redemption.
Yeah, but we cannot posit it because like you said, there seem to be two traditions in the Christian world. There's a tradition of final restoration, which you find in Revelation as well, by the way, because it says the last thing to die is death itself, right? There's the sense in which death is thrown into the fire. And so what exactly is that referring to? There's a sense in which the heavenly Jerusalem descends and fills up the entire world. So you have these images, and then you also have an image of evil being completely, let's say, cast off. And those two kind of exist in a kind of uneasy...
I was thinking about this the other day when I was thinking about making a video addressed to the Islamic world, as preposterous as that might sound. because one of the things you want to do when you're talking to people is you want to distinguish between them as of intrinsic value and redeemable in some final sense, just as you are, and ideas that might be possessing them that have either this misplaced good element to them or this vengeful element. And so, you don't want to use a horrible cliche, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so maybe the separation of the wheat from the chaff is a spiritual discrimination that doesn't throw out the entire being along with the judgment.
Yeah. If you understand it fractally, then I think that makes sense. If you read, like, for example, C.S. Lewis is a great example of someone who kind of was going in that direction, was hinting at some things. He talked about how, like, this notion that the key to hell is locked from the inside.
Right.
Like, that no matter, even, like, I think C.S. Lewis said, like, even in the depth of hell, if Satan wanted to repent, that's
what Milton said too.
It's not happening because that's the role that's in the story. This is the character that helping you understand this part of the cosmos, or the part of the way that the world is laying itself out. And you see that in some of the Syrian fathers, for example, St. Ephraim the Syrian, he says things like that, where he says, the fire in hell is the same fire that was at Pentecost. The fire in hell is the love of God. And it's only that, to the extent that you refuse to be transformed, and you hold on to your, let's say, parasitic good, that is what the fire of hell is.
Well, right. Well, part of that is that as you become more divorced from, let's say, what constitutes a sustainable and valid good, the farther you get away from that, whether it's merely by pursuing a misplaced good or it's by conscious design, the more that elevates itself up as the harshest possible judge that will do the most damage to your current ethic and then destabilize your whole perceptions. And so that's so interesting, because as you deviate, speaking spiritually, as you deviate from God, he becomes more tyrannical in some sense to you and more judgmental. And it's also partly because this is why the Catholic idea of confession isn't what's often pilloried, because, people laugh. Well, you're a Catholic, you can sin your whole life, and on your deathbed, you can repent. It's like, yeah, but you have to face the magnitude of everything you did wrong. So repentance isn't just, well, I'm sorry. It's like, you're actually sorry. And if you've stacked up a lifetime of sins, what makes you think that you're going to have the moral wherewithal on your deathbed to confront that without anything? Well, it's just absolute existential terror. So there's no easy out from that.
So
sorry, we're on a whole other thread.
Yeah. No. I mean, I thought the discussion was important, and what you just said, Jordan, is important. I for one would not want immortality, because when I look back at the foolishness and the vices of my past, it's hard. So people who think they could just sort of sin and mouth a repentance, I don't think that's.
Well, they also think they can, in some sense, pull one over God.
Yeah.
We'll abide by this rule that we'll never use religious language when we can use any other kind of language.
No.
I know you weren't objecting to that, but I think it's a good principle.
I'm happy to talk about it. But I don't. Well, let me say, there's something underneath the religious discussion that is sort of a central concern to me at this point. And I'll invoke Kant. Kant writes the three critiques, right? The critique of pure reason, practical reason, and judgment, right? And Habermas makes a great point of this. I'm coming to the point, which is, since Kant, we don't have an integrated normativity. We have three autonomous spheres of normativity around the true, the epistemic, the good, and the beautiful. And what Kant did, and one of the problems of modernity, and this is Habermas's point, is he made a very strong case for the autonomy of each. Right? Beauty is beauty.
So that's partly why you objected in the way you did when you emailed me back. Because
exactly.
I was talking about an ethic that would unite, and you said, well, it's differentiated, true, beautiful, and good.
Right.
My response to that would be something like, well, whatever God is, fundamentally ineffable, so we'll make that We'll make that clear to begin with. But I would say that one way of thinking about the way we think about God is that God is what's common to the good, the true, and the beautiful.
So this gets us into the discussion that I think is, for me, sort of the deepest levels of the phenomenology and the cognition, which is, I mean, Jonathan would know, this is the classical doctrine. The classical way of putting this is the convertible of the transcendentals are convertible into each other. So somehow the true and the good and the beautiful are one, but not mathematical identity. This is really important. It's not like you can, right? And so, Aquinas wrestles with this. I've been reading Maximus, by the way.
I think you see a reflection of that in the idea of the Trinity too.
Well, of course, right? And so the issue there is, and I've been reading D.C. Schindler on the Catholicity of Reason, and he talks about this. He gets it from Balthasar. He talks about the primacy of beauty, the centrality of goodness, and the ultimacy of truth. That they are superlative, but in different ways. So what he means by that is there's a primacy to beauty. And this is a classic Platonic argument. If you don't have beauty, all the other normativities are not available to you.
Right. So why right? That's not so, like I wrote a chapter in my last book on the necessity of beauty, but I don't understand why primary?
Because,
and what does that say about our perception that it's primary? Right? Because you don't have to think about it. Is that part of it? Is that you apprehend it? I don't understand exactly.
Well, a way of thinking about it is, Scarry wrote a really beautiful book called Beauty and how it prepares us for truth and justice. And the idea, so let's take something that's very culturally relevant and something I've been talking about. So we are immersed in what Ricoeur called a hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of suspicion is that appearances are always distorting, distracting, deceiving us from reality. That's the hermeneutics of suspicion. And the moment of truth is when you reveal the hidden cabal, the conspiracy, right? This is the hermeneutics of suspicion. And it's, and Ricoeur's point is we got this.
That's what Freud does. Marx does.
Freud and Marx.
It's the uncovering.
Here's
what's really going on. The deconstruction is here's what's really going on.
Exactly. It's everywhere now.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Okay. Now, Now here's Merleau-Ponty's point about this, right? His point is, but wait, the hermeneutics the hermeneutics of suspicion is always dependent on this. If I say that's unreal, oh, look, I do that because I say that's real. Realization is always a comparative judgment. This is his point. So
does he accept the notion that there is something? Because one of the things you see in the postmodern types, and I was looking at Richard Rorty's work the other day, and he seems to buy the postmodern idea that everything is just a network of linguistic representation and that there is no real beyond that.
That's Dylan's critique of that being semi-logical reductionism. All you do is transfer all the markers of reality onto properties of the text. And then you prevent the text from being subject to the very criticisms you're making of reality.
Yeah. Well, that seems credible to me. Okay. So it was Merleau-Ponty accepts the reality of beauty.
Right, exactly. Because think about what this means. If the hermeneutics of suspicion is, right, that appearances distract us, deceive us, distort.
Right. There has to be something under that.
Right. And beauty is when appearances disclose reality.
That's right. Yeah. I
believe that.
That's the artist. That's the artist take, or that's the liturgical take, or it's the beauty of a church, or the beauty of an icon, or it's the notion that God, or ultimate reality, or however you want to phrase it, is disclosing itself to us, and that appears to us as the connection between that which we encounter, these pattern beings that we encounter, and what they reveal to us about the other transcendentals. And
well, when I wrote this chapter, which is my favorite chapter in both books, it's try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. And so it's this sort of step behind, well, order your room first so that it's just not cluttered and idiotic and running at counter purposes to whatever your purposes are, a reflection of your internal chaos. Get it orderly, but that's not good enough. The next thing is see if you can make a relationship with beauty, which is really, it's really, people are afraid of that, because I've watched people try to buy art and they're terrified of buying art. And the reason is because their choice puts their taste on display. And if their taste is undeveloped, then their inability to distinguish between a false appearance and the genuine reality of beauty is immediately revealed to people. So they're terrified of it, but they're also equally terrified of beauty. So let me tell you a story about this, if you don't mind. I bought some Russian Impressionist paintings for my father, and I liked them a lot. This particular artist, the Russian Impressionist style is like the French Impressionist style, except it's a lot rougher. The brushstrokes are thicker, so it's lower resolution, but it's equally beautiful in terms of palette. And I have a variety of paintings. If you get some distance from them, they just snap into representation. So lovely. And so I sent my dad like 8 of these paintings. And my mom took one look at them and she said, those are not coming out of the basement. And my mom is a conservative person. So she's not high in openness. She's not that interested in ideas. And and her aesthetic sense isn't sophisticated. Now, my mother has a lot of lovely attributes, and my dad and her differ in that. And so he loved these paintings, and then he made these frames for them. And then he brought one up, and my mom tolerated that. And then he brought another one up, and then she tolerated that. And then like all 8 of them eventually made it upstairs. And then a few years later, I was there, and she told me how much she loved the paintings. But they really set her off. And I think it was partly because, well, if you're comfortable in your canonical perceptions of objects in some sense, and then the Impressionists come along and say, you could look at that whole landscape as if it was nothing but the interplay of color. And we forget how radical that is. I mean, those paintings caused riots in Paris when they were first showed, Impressionist paintings. And that's what my mother was reacting to. It's like, oh my God, there's a whole different way of looking at the world. I don't want to see that. And it's an invitation to that which is beyond the triviality of your perceptions, let's say. But it's to think that there's nothing about that that's worth being frightened of or challenging. You don't understand conservatives if you don't see that. So,
but in terms of beauty, one of the things that especially now, one of the problems or the way that beauty can kind of overwhelm us is that we feel as if we give ourselves, we're afraid of the suspicion, the hermeneutics of suspicion. We're afraid that if we see reality discloses itself to us and we can see the connection between that which is appearing to me and something behind it, then I'm afraid that if I make that leap, then I'll be betrayed. Yeah. Or that it will
that it won't turn out to be real,
and sometimes it's not. Like it is possible to be tricked by appearances.
Mm-hmm. And this gets you to Hans, Saving Beauty. His critique of what you see going on right now is he argues, if you read ancient texts, if you read Plotinus, one of the features they'll say about beauty is it's striking and disturbing and disrupting. Mm-hmm. Right. I want to come back to that about the transformative aspect of truth, but right, the transformative theory of truth. And Han talks about, what we've done, right, and he talks about it in other books too, is we try to reduce the beautiful to the smooth, which is the ease at which we can consume something. Yeah,
like the smooth outer cover of a car.
Exactly.
Right. 1 pixel resolution.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And because what that does is it gives you, and I'll use this word deliberately, the veneer of beauty, but while protecting you from the hermeneutics of suspicion. Smart. Yeah. Right? You see that? So what we do is, and then he says, and pornography is the primary example of that, because what you do is you remove all threat, all mystery, all otherness from the person. So there's no way they can strike you or disturb you. There's no way
reject you.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so pornography is an example of the smooth completely overtaking the beautiful and being misunderstood as the beautiful. But if you gentlemen are in agreement with that, what that means, that's my answer to why the primacy of beauty. Because if you do not get that ability to, and I want to use this word in two senses.
Sorry, please go ahead. Then I'll ask.
Yeah. I want to say through the way I'm saying, like through my glasses, beyond and by means of, if we can't properly get a moment where we can see through appearance into reality, we are locked into solipsism and skepticism. Mm-hmm. You need a primary move. Right. And if you do it rather than it is called to you, then you are trapped, right? You need something that calls you from beyond the appearances so that you can properly align appearances to reality and you realize. That's why the primacy of
So
beauty.
is that the ontological calling you out of epistemology?
I would argue that that's Plato's argument for how the beauty.
Okay, so when you say, so I've thought a lot about the relationship between love and truth, and I think love is primary, and the truth is the handmaiden of love in some sense. But so there's a primacy there. I would say the primacy of love, but you're making an argument for the primacy of beauty. And so are they contradictory arguments?
No, not at all, because Plato's view of love, and you have to be careful because Plato is taking the Greek notion of eros and he's trying to bend it. And I think he's trying to bend it towards what the Christians are going to eventually talk about in agape.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So take that as a caveat on what I'm saying. But nevertheless, what's going on, right, is Plato says, no. What love is that you are called to beauty. And let me just try and show you. Give me a sec because there's a connection.
Yeah.
Okay. So this will sound like, where's he out of left field, but like truth, rationality. Most of the cognitive biases, in fact, there's a growing argument that a lot of the cognitive biases, confirmation bias, blah, 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 a lot of them are actually aspects of the my side bias. Egocentrism. I won't make that argument here. I think it's a good argument. But let's say, even if it's only partially true, this is an important point. And Spinoza got this, right? This orientation, self-relevance, how things are relevant to me, right? That sort of fundamental egocentrism, a fundamental way in which you're prioritizing your perception on the world, right? You can't reason your way out of that. Spinoza, the most logical of the philosophers, says, no. The only thing that will invert the arrow of relevance is love. This is Murdoch's point. Love is when you recognize something other than yourself as real.
Right.
Okay. So let me ask you about that, because I've been thinking about the idea of being selfish.
Yes.
Psychopaths are selfish, but they also betray themselves.
Yes.
Because psychopaths don't learn from experience, and
Yes.
they doom their future selves.
Yes.
And so I kind of wonder if the love that lifts you out of this self-orientation, what it does in some sense is that it's the way you see the world. If you see beyond this narrow selfishness, because I don't really think there's any difference technically in me taking care of the multitude of future selves that I will become and me treating you properly.
I totally agree.
Okay,
I think
fine.
your relationship to your future self is ultimately an agapic relationship. And I think that's the only way you can deal with a lot of the empirical research.
Okay.
So
you do.
Yeah, yes.
Why the empirical research?
Because
then?
I think the empirical research shows that, I mentioned it in the Cambridge talk that I sent you the link to, right? What if you do this? This is one instance among many experiments. You go into a bunch of academics at a university, the people who are supposed to be the best at taking data and processing it. You present them with all the evidence that they should start saving for their retirement right now.
Right.
And they won't do it. You come back 6 months later, you ask them at the time, is this argument a solid argument? Great evidence.
Yeah.
Come back 6 months. Have they changed? Not at all.
Yeah. The behavioral therapists know that perfectly well.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you do the following, you say, I want you to imagine your future self as a family member that you love and care about.
Right. They
will start to save, and more importantly, the vividness of that imagery predicts how well.
Well, that's so cool. Look, this program that we worked on, future authoring program.
Yes.
Well, it's predicated on the idea of developing a love for your future self. So it's an exercise. It's a real sense. It's like here, and it's the ethic that's underneath it, although this wasn't particularly conscious in my mind when I built it, was knock and the door will open. It's like, okay, let's play a game. You get to have what you want and need. But the rule is, first of all, you have to accept it. And second of all, you have to specify it. And so, but let's just play it as a game.
Yeah.
If you could envision a future that would justify your suffering, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Justify your suffering. What would that entail? And then I make it practical. It's like, well, what do you want for an intimate relationship? How do you want to treat your family members? What sort of job or career? Like I break it into 7 practicalities, to nail it down to the ground. And I do believe that, one of the things we thought, well, what predicts whether or not this works? Because it really works. We dropped the dropout rate of young men at Mohawk College. 50%.
It should. It should.
Well, it did.
Yes.
And it had the biggest effect on those who were doing the worst, which is not very common for psychological interventions. But the only thing we could find content-wise that predicted how well it would work was number of words written. And so my sense was, well, that just was an index, a rough index of how much thought they put into it and how vividly, and then it would be, did they treat their future self with some love, like genuinely? And then did they differentiate that so it wasn't just an abstract mountaintop conceptualization? So,
but let's add one wrinkle that brings the beauty thing back. Because you go back and ask them, why didn't you pay attention to your future self?
Before. Well, sometimes people don't think they could. They have no idea that that's even a possibility.
That's, I don't deny that.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, people said, I don't want to look at that person because that's me, old and ugly.
They're afraid of it.
Yeah. And it's an aesthetic judgment. It's an aesthetic judgment. Right. And what you have to do is get them to reform it. But what if that's an old...
It's a shallow aesthetic judgment.
Yes. That's
right.
Exactly.
My wife, she does portraits. And one of the things that's really interesting about my wife's art is she will look at, she's like Goya, although, Goya is Goya, obviously. But one of the things I really found striking about Tammy is she did a very detailed picture of my daughter's surgical wound. And that's not an easy thing to look at, right? Because you don't want to look at that. But that also ties in with the ideas we've been discussing about the fact that, so in the story of Exodus, when God tells Moses how to stop the Israelites from being bitten by poisonous snakes, he insists that they have to look at what's poisoning them. And, well, I think that's the crucifixion message,
it's the mystery of the crucifixion.
You bet, right.
All these images that we have, like the beauty of Christ's wounds, all these things which sound so completely
pathological.
To many people, if you can understand them properly, you can understand that's
you have to gaze on that which most threatens you.
Yeah, there's a verse,
and then you say, well, this inadequacy of vulnerability that characterizes old age, there's a terror in that.
Yeah,
and so people won't go there.
Right, but what you do is you replace the shallow aesthetic. Right. Don't let the appearances distract you.
Right.
Let the appearances disclose. What if that was an old family member who's always look through and see that those appearances that's somebody who's been there, right? That you care about.
Someone you love.
Exactly. And so you beautify them, so you love them, and the love and the beauty, they reinforce each other. So for me, to answer your question, right, you're saying the primacy of love, and I think you ultimately mean agapic love, right? That and beauty are, if you're incapable of turning the arrow of relevance and saying, I want that to exist rather than I want that to exist for me. Right? That's what beauty does. And that's also the central move, I would argue, in love.
Okay. So do we want to detour into the true and it's beautiful, true and
the good.
The good. Do you have something equally revealing to say about the good and the true?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, well, let's go there, and then we'll continue through this because I thought that was really useful.
Well, and I would like us, if I would request that we return back to that, whatever this discourse, whatever. I love following the logos. That's I aspire to be like Socrates,
spoken like a true Christian.
Well, but spoken like a true follower of Socrates too, right?
Fair enough.
Right. But I'm hoping that in this dialogos, if we get into the depths of the true, the good, and the beautiful, that we can address my criticism of you.
Yep.
Which is, I'm making a criticism on behalf of the Enlightenment and Kant.
Yes.
Which is the fracturing of the normativities into three autonomous spheres.
Yep.
And this argument, if it's going to go forward, needs something that would.
Yep. I see what you're doing. You bet.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's
Jonathan?
fine. Yeah, that's okay.
Right. Okay. So for me, the thing I want to say, first about the good is, there's two readings to make about this. And one is, and this is what the Enlightenment did, we can reduce, and Jonathan's already challenged this, but we can reduce we can reduce the good to the ethical good. So that when we're talking about goodness, we're asking how moral a person is in the standard modern meaning, right? Now, what Plato argues is that is actually a derivative form of goodness.
It's kind of an algorithmic form.
But So here's the central sort of, at least I would argue. Now, of course, there are going to be 10,000 Platonists who will disagree with everything I say because Plato's been around so long, right? But I think I could make a good case, and I think this lines up with the best book I've ever read on Plato, D.C. Schindler's Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. The best book, hands down, my whole life. D.C. Schindler's astonishing. But here's a proposal, right? And you can see Descartes wrestling with this in the Enlightenment and sort of failing. We need intelligibility to be wedded to reality. Right? The structures of intelligibility have to be not identical to, because that's impossible. You try idealism, but that fails. I'm sorry, that was too fast for some people, but I'll just let that go. But so
the map has to correspond to the territory.
More than correspond, there has to be a conformity. There has to be a contact and a wedding to them together. There can't be a space between them, like there is between map and territory, because as soon as there's a space, there's what guarantees and what manages the space. And at some point, this is Taylor's point, you need a contact epistemology, not, right? Okay.
Right.
So now there's nothing you can do, right, that will show me or give me an argument for why intelligibility should conform that way to reality. Because what you'll do is you get locked in, right? And this is what Plato saw, right? But what Plato's basically saying is it's like, if I can put it this way, I'll try and put it in a way that's more narrative. It's like there's a perpetual promise that intelligibility will track reality, and that we find that to be inexhaustibly the case. But there's no argument we can give that will ultimately explain that, because every argument presupposes it. Does that track as?
I'm not sure why the last part of that is true, although I agree that it's true. So, and what's running around in the back of my head while you're laying that out is, I think, well, in some sense, that's the problem that evolution solves in a technical sense. So, let's say a mosquito lays 1 million eggs in its lifetime. And so that's 1 million mosquitoes whose epistemology better track ontology, but almost none of them do. So they all die.
Yes.
And so that mapping, I think, because it's philosophically impossible in some sense, I think that the process of evolution is actually what solves that. And then our cognitive architecture emerges out of that evolved base. And so it's taken 3.5 billion years to produce the solutions that we have to mapping intelligibility onto. I
totally agree with you about this. I agree, so let me agree and then tell you why I think it goes deeper. Yeah. Okay. So just very quickly, I think relevance realization basically does that same thing that evolution does. It has it's a self-organizing system in which you would introduce variation and then selection. Your attention's doing it right now. There's a drive to open up, mind wander, vary. And then and what you're doing is constantly evolving your fittedness, your optimal gripping. So
towards some end, which is the dialogue of the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And whatever that's embedded in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're doing this.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's a space of associations beside what you're doing.
But what I'm saying is evolution actually presupposes an ontology in which that will work.
Right.
So that's the deeper point. Okay. Okay.
So that you should have something to say about that.
But we've talked about that before. Like when we did that thing on Genesis, and you talk about how it's this idea of a psychic projection. But the idea that, let's say Jung, for example, could imagine that you could psychically project patterns and onto the world means that it presupposes that the same problem. That means that those patterns are presupposed in the manner in which the world exists for that to even be
right. And the historians of science I've read who attempt to embed the development of science in a Judeo Christian ethic by necessity, also, giving obeisance, let's say, to the influence of the Enlightenment, say that the notion that there was a logos, there's an ontological logos as well as an epistemological logos, was a precondition for the development of the scientific attitude. And I think that's true.
Yes. And I think, and that's the cornerstone of ancient epistemology. You don't ask the question, how from this, the workings of my mind do I get to the ontology? You ask the question, well, whatever knowledge there is presupposes intelligibility, right? And then I have to ask, what must the world be like such that intelligibility reliably exists? It's a very different orientation.
That's for sure.
Okay. So, but let's take it that this is at least a plausible argument. the promise that intelligibility is wedded to reality and that we can realize it through something like relevance realization, cognitively or biologically, adaptivity through evolution, right? That promise is continually made, but we can give no explanation for it because given what we've just said, every attempt to explain it presupposes it as a fundamental thing.
Okay, that seems just fine to me.
The fact that the promise is inexhaustibly kept is the good.
Is that the good that is referred to in Genesis when God uses the logos to derive habitable order out of chaos and says it is good? Is that the same idea?
I hope so. I mean, for me, that's what Plato means when he talks about how the good is even beyond being. Yeah. Because the good makes possible the intelligibility of reality.
Okay, well, that's kind of what I'm trying to also drive at in this system of propositions.
And that's what I meant, and I hope you took it as a compliment when I said I think this is a Neoplatonic argument you're making. You're doing a lot of the similar moves.
Okay.
Now, the thing I have is, right, so that's the good, and then is there a way of, and I think Jonathan will have some important things to say.
So that's like the a priori structure of being. Before there's actually beings. It's like there's a potential intelligibility even for the finite in relation to the infinite.
Exactly. Because and what you can do is you can reject that fundamental goodness. And notice, I can't give you an argument to get you back into it. But if you reject that fundamental goodness, you see Descartes wrestling with this because he tries to, he gets sort of stuck inside the cogito. Right. And he's trying, I
think, therefore I am.
Right. And he realizes, I could be trapped in solipsism and skepticism. And what does he do? He says, no. There must be a God that guarantees that the intelligibility, the clear and distinct ideas map onto reality. He realizes he needs something outside of the argument in order to guarantee that fundamental goodness that makes everything else possible. But then what he does is he creates famously a circular argument for that God. And so he tries to make an argument for it, but he ends up presupposing the very thing he's trying to prove. This is what I mean by our apprehension of it is not something that is produced inferentially. It is an apprehension of this fundamental goodness. And I can't give you an argument or an evidence for it. Now, I think ethical goodness is dependent on and reflective of, at times exemplary of, that ontological, if you'll allow me, goodness.
And don't you think that that's the reason why in so many traditions, the infinite is always referred to negatively, like the whole notion of negative theology or...
Oh, that's interesting. Say more.
Well, the idea that if you want to express that which is the source of being, you end up having it it empties itself.
Yes.
It empties itself of all characteristics, while recognizing that it is at the same time the summation of all character. It's like the good ultimately is that which everything is culminating to, and then it's a kind of giving away into something which is always more.
And you think that's related to that a priori acceptance of the existence of the relationship between intelligence and being? Well, that this thing that guarantees that is being pointed at by these processes.
I think so. I don't know, I can take you on this experiment that I've talked about. This idea that identity is kenotic, that identity always kind of empties itself into more. Mm-hmm. So you always use the example of an object, like you have a cup, and then you have at a certain level, you have different aspects of the cup. Yeah. And so in order for it to reach its good, all these elements, in order for them to reach its good, they have to give themselves into something which cannot be found at the level of their elements. And so what you end up having is you have hierarchies of beings that are moving towards that identity, but as they reach their highest point, they actually empty themselves into the higher identity. And then you move up, and then you end up with something that is beyond being ultimately.
Okay, so let me try something to you, because that might start to sew the good and the true and the beautiful together. I've been doing a lot on marrying Merleau-Ponty with Plato, and John Rootson and other people are doing this. So I will. But here, like that thing you just pointed out. So Merleau-Ponty's point is you can never completely see any object. So let's just talk, because the number of just even perceptual aspects is unlimited.
Which was what Picasso was doing.
Yeah, right. And then, of course, then there's the imaginal aspects. I can also, all the functions that are implicit in this, all the use, like, right? And then, so one of the things I've been arguing is that if you take a look at Plato, the eidos originally meant the look of a thing, but he didn't mean the look. He meant something like the aspect. And here's what so you have all of these aspects and they're unfolding inexhaustibly. There's a through, but they don't unfold chaotically. No. There's a coherent through line that runs through them. Right? You get a sense of, as you said, the identity. But here's the thing. That through line is not itself an aspect.
No.
It can't be.
It can't be.
Because if you're making a fundamental
it's an a priori necessity.
Right. And it runs through it. But notice how, right? First of all, that's starting to get us into, a sense of the goodness, because that's the promise being kept. The through line is the promise being kept. It's also a different notion of truth. This is something I want to talk about later if we get a chance. Truth as aletheia, as disclosure, rather than as correspondence. But notice, first of all, how that corresponds to beauty. And think about what Tammy's doing with the paintings. She's, right? Because she's, don't stop at this one aspect as the appearance, but open it up. Open up all and see and fulfill the promise.
Yeah.
The aspects.
Even in something horrible.
Yes.
So
And maybe that's dependent on your willingness to gaze, which is the story of Exodus and the bronze serpent. Well, and I would say the crucifixion as well.
That's really interesting, because Han talks about we've lost the ability to linger with things. And that's why we can no longer
if chimps are in the jungle and they come across a decent sized snake, they'll stand at a distance from it, but they will gaze at it for up to 24 hours. And they have a particular cry, which is a snake ra. That's the name of the cry, which they utter that brings other chimps. And so they hate snakes, right? Innately. Yeah. If you show a rubber snake to a chimp that's never seen one, he'll hit the ceiling, but then he'll look. And so they're out there gazing on the snake. It's part of, they're fascinated by it, despite the fact that it's also simultaneously threatening.
Yes. And so I think that there's increasing evidence for something like awe.
It's awe, definitely. Right. Well, that's manifest in piloerection in animals.
Okay, but think about what awe does. Awe is a kind of love. And one of the things awe does, which is really interesting, it's one of the few instances where people reliably report a sense of the shrinkage of the self that is nevertheless has a positive element to it. Yeah. Even though they're terrified, they want to follow it through. They want to go into, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's partly. So imagine this. So imagine awe. Imagine piloerection now. So a cat puffs up and, that's the hair standing up in the back of your neck. It's the same instinct.
It is. Yeah. And I'm doing work on this with a student of mine right now and how we've exacted the piloerection into aesthetic experience.
Right. Okay. So imagine this. Now you're out, you look at the night sky and it's awe-inspiring. And so there's also a call to imitate there. Yes. And so you see the image of Mary, for example, with her foot on the serpent and her head in the stars. Well, she's looking at the stars and so that's the cosmic realm. It's the infinite. And now she's awestruck by that vision. And then in order to adapt to that vision of the infinite, you have to imitate that which instills the awe. And that's represented by her foot on the serpent.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes, that's for sure. That's there's literally hundreds of Renaissance images of that. Mary, head in the stars, foot on the serpent. And I've been thinking through this awe issue and it has this interesting association with beauty. But you can imagine that when a cat dances sideways and piloerects, it's trying to look larger. It's trying to look as if it can overcome the predator. Well, that's what awe does to us, is that when historically, evolutionarily, what we did when we felt awe in the face of a predator is we felt compelled to imitate the predator so that we could become ferocious enough to overcome the predator.
That's interesting.
And so that's that call to an expanded being that Jung would associate, for example, with development of the shadow. It's like when you look at something brutal, that really terrifies you, it has to call that capacity for predatory behavior out of it, that monstrous capacity. Now, it should be integrated into the kind of ethic that we're describing, but you're not good if you're harmless. It's way more than that. And that awe in the face of what's catastrophic is a call to be more than the catastrophic thing, which certainly makes you monstrous in a sense.
Well, that's really interesting, because it's also it also produces sort of increased seeking of others. which makes sense because one of the ways we can make ourselves bigger,
band together.
Mm-hmm. And then that seems to get exacted into, right? I don't have to be big, but I can connect or participate in something.
Right.
Right. And then you get reverence as opposed to just raw awe. What's really interesting, just to supplement your argument, and this is work I'm doing with Hong Yu Chen. If you like, they have a device now that will actually cause people to have chills. The chills up and down their spine. You run cold water up and down in the right way. What you do and what you can do is you can really enhance people's aesthetic experience. But even more basically, you get people to listen to the same passage of music, and you put one group of people in a slightly cooler room. They will have a more powerful aesthetic experience of the music. Because
it facilitates piloerection.
Exactly.
That's so cool. Yeah, I was so thrilled about this notion of piloerection being associated with the instinct to imitate. To put those two things together, it's like, well, what do you do in the face of the predator? Well, one is run away. The other is become superordinate to the predator. And then you might say, well, what's the worst possible predator? Which I think is part of the Judeo Christian narrative, because we're trying to because the snake in the garden is Satan. It's like, well, what's the worst predator? It's not the snake, bad as snakes are. It's like a super snake. It's a meta snake. It's the sum total of everything that threatens you. And so that calls you to be more than that, whatever that is.
I don't know a lot about the biology, but do animals experience this piloerection with, let's say, a member of their own species that is bigger or more dominating?
Sure.
Yes, they do.
Sure.
And we also have some preliminary, and it's ethnographic, so you have to be careful with it, that they do something that looks like awe. You'll get a monkey. You've got the snake thing, but there's also a video like of a macaque monkey, and it goes out onto a precipice, which is a little bit dangerous, to watch a sunrise, not doing anything. It just sits there.
Well, monkeys will look longer. If you show them photos of their troop, they gaze longer at the high status individuals as well.
Yes.
And if they are encountering a high status individual who could take them out in some sense, but not merely as an expression of power, as the primatologists insist, then they do show piloerection in response to the threat from the superior. But they're also fascinated by it. And you can imagine that part of that fascination is the locking of their attention onto what they could become.
Right. Because that's what, at least that it interests me more in the sense of beauty, right?
Yes.
Where it is this sense of shrinking in front of something, in the sense, feeling that you're smaller than that. And then this desire to move into it, or
imitation as a kind of internalization, a kind of wedding yourself to someone in a profound way.
And it's a form of worship, a primary form of worship, right? Because you worship what you imitate what you worship. They're the same thing. Yeah. And so, okay, well, that was fun. So shall we move to the next one?
I think so. I mean, I'm getting a sense of how the true, the good, and the beautiful could be potentially integrated. Because I think that's a necessary requirement for this argument. And notice how we are moving outside of, we didn't talk about true. We can talk about that later at some point. We're moving outside of sort of standard ways of talking about at least goodness and beauty here. And I think there's similar ways of doing it at truth that could actually get us back to something that,
well, it's nice to put the biological twist on it too.
I wanted to run one thing before we move on, which is that the way that I tend to think about it in terms of, when we talked about the idea of the through line.
Yes.
Say you have
I think that's the eidos. I think that's what the form is in Plato. Well, it isn't what Aristotle thought it was. It isn't just a specificity of necessary and sufficient conditions.
So would you feel comfortable with the notion that it's the manner in which the multiplicity is gathered?
It's the logos.
Right. And so it actually gathers multiplicity.
Don't listen to my words. Listen to the logos that gathers them together. All things are one, right? Heraclitus.
So then what we would presume provisionally is that the thing that unites the true, the good, and the beautiful is the logos. Now, we shouldn't make the presumption of knowing that we understand what that logos is. We've got some hints about what it is, but we can't characterize it entirely. Is that a reasonable proposition in your estimation?
I think so. I think, especially if we're careful to do what you did before, which is we have a dipolar way of invoking the logos. The logos is both the gathering, all right, the through lining, if I can put it that way, but it is also, it is also the ontological reality that affords that happening. It's the fact that I can't exhaust it, right? No matter how far I push it. So whatever through line I have is at most a signification or a symbol of the fact that it's inexhaustible. Did that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
What do you, no, I'm not sure I understand. That the through line is the significance that it's inexhaustible in the manner in which it points up, or in the manner in which it inexhaustible like this, or inexhaustible in the
manner
sense
in which it's the fact that intelligibility between representation and actuality remains regardless of how far you push it.
Okay.
So that would sort of be like the notion that the universe is logical, logos-based, essentially. And that we're not going to run out of that.
But it's not going to be logical in the modern sense of a complete system, even though Godel tells us
you can't reduce it to an algorithm.
Exactly. So this is what I mean by saying I don't think of the form as like a standard Aristotelian essence, at least how it's been taught to me, which is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Like
there's no becoming in that, is there? There's just being.
Well,
right? Because becoming implies transformation of something that's algorithmic, but in a manner that doesn't escape from the logos. And I mean, I think that's how reality constitutes itself. And that's part of the solution to the scandal of induction. It's like, no, you can't predict with 100% certainty what's going to happen next, but what will happen next, despite its unpredictability, like the next note in a symphony, is still predictable.
Exactly. This is what I mean about the good. The reason why Hume couldn't deal with the problem of induction is it requires the apprehension of the good, which is the promise that this is not going to be logical identity, but nevertheless, it is going to be inexhaustibly coherent. It's going to remain beautiful. And in that sense, it's always going to be something to which you can conform.
It's not reducible to an algorithm, but that doesn't mean, well, you said it. That doesn't mean it's not habitable. Doesn't mean it's not good. It doesn't mean it's not coherent.
Exactly.
Right.
And your example, the music, which John Rusin used, the musicality of intelligibility is, I think, the best way to think about it.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's I actually think that's why we like music.
Yes.
Because I think that music is actually the most representational art form. Because for a variety of reasons. First of all, we don't see objects, we see patterns, and we interpret some patterns as objects. So patterns are primary. Then we're looking for the harmonious interplay of patterns. And then it's not strictly a causal relationship, because the music is governed by principles, but it's not formally predictable. Otherwise it gets boring.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So you see that, I think, most particularly, I've experienced that most particularly with Bach's Brandenburg concertos, which have this amazing continual unfolding that's so logical, it almost appears mathematical, and yet it's unpredictable, and you don't know where it's going to go.
Exactly.
And it goes there and you think, man, that's just right.
Yes.
So
yeah, and so you could say that about pretty much everything that exists. That is that, I like the glass because it's just easy. So the idea is that there is a through line in this glass, but the through line goes through potentiality, which is indefinite. Mm-hmm. That is, I can encounter a million glasses in my life, and they will all be different.
Well, that's like the realm of musical possibility.
Exactly. But they all end up being predictable to a certain extent once I grasp it. Like when I see the glass, I recognize it, but I couldn't have predicted that this is the glass that would exist. There's a kind of potentiality which is maintained within the identity of the glass, but is not, it's inexhaustible.
Right. And when you see that, when you apprehend that, and this is Scari's point, this is being struck by beauty. You see the tree, and it's like every other tree you've seen, and yet it's not. Mm-hmm. It reminds you of the eidos. It reminds you of just what you said.
And that's love. I think that's love too. Like in love, in the sense that I've often said love is the capacity for unity and multiplicity to exist. That's what love is, right? That is that I recognize something of you that we have in common, but I also recognize you're completely separate from me. And that is
and then both are valued.
Those both have to coexist for love to be real. It has to be separation.
Well,
and communion.
To give the devil his due, I would say that's the kernel of good that the diversity types are pushing. We need to recognize the utility of multiplicity. It's like, fair enough. The problem with that is, well, yeah, but where's the unity here? Where's the unity? It's all diversity. It can't be all diversity, because then all we do, we're in conflict.
Yeah.
So,
and we tend to be, the modern world tends towards radical. They tend to want to change unity to uniformity, and then have this kind of crazy exploded multiplicity. Whereas this kind of natural relationship between otherness is exactly this, both recognizing what we have in common and at the same time being kind of fascinated and attracted to that which we have.
Well, you think about the reason this conversation works is because we have grounds for commonality in our understanding, but that would be sterile without the multiplicity because we would just run over the same territory. And so, we hope we aim towards the same thing enough so that we can communicate, but I wouldn't like it at all if each of you didn't bring something to bear on the discussion that I'm incapable of bringing to bear on it.
So the last thing I want to bring up is, of course, I mean, people are going to say I'm Jesus smuggling, but that's the reason, one of the reasons, or why we can understand that in Christianity, the Trinity is seen as the infinite, is the image of the infinite that we have is a contradictory possibility of absolute unity and absolute multiplicity. And so we just throw those two up at the same time. And we say the infinite is absolutely multiple and absolutely one. And you cannot, without contradiction, and you cannot you can't reconcile that completely, because that is ultimately it's a problem which fractally appears everywhere anyways, because everything in the world has something in common with everything else. Yes. Whether, if it's just being itself. But it also necessarily must be different for the difference to
There's stronger
manifest
arguments. There's Goodman argument. Every object is infinitely similar and infinitely similar to every
which
other.
Is a restatement of the problem of perception itself.
Yes.
It's like, well, you've seen a glass, yes, but you haven't seen this glass. Well, how much difference is there? Well, there's an infinite number of differences, as it turns out. All right, so this is quite a switch here, and I think this is a radical proposition. Maybe not. Because once you hear it, you think, well, yes. And then you think, well, that's self-evidence. Like, yeah, well, not so quick here. The description of a structure of values or an ethic, subject to the codicils that we've already added, or set of priorities is a narrative. So the description of a system of perceptual prioritizations and actions is a narrative. What do you think? It could also be representation in image. It wouldn't have to be a verbal description.
No, I grant that.
Imagistic or verbal description. That is what we regard as a narrative.
So this is what I wanted to, again, challenge you on. And it sort of overlaps with the discussion we've having about the true and the good and the beautiful, because I think there are three different dimensions by which we organize intelligibility. So there's the narrative. The example I use is video games. And there's a reason why people are doing the virtual exodus. They're preferring video games over the real world because of the dimensions that are found in video games. So one is a narrative, and the narrative they belong to. Clearly, that's one of the things. So total agreement with that. But there's two other features that are deeply meaningful to them. Not semantic, but meaning in life meaningful to them. One is a nomological order. There's a set of rules that they understand that makes sense of that world, so that they can move around in that world with confidence. Because if they have a narrative, but it isn't undergirded by
is that a reflection in the video game of the same through line and mapping of intelligibility onto ontology within the?
That's what I think the nomological.
But it's a simpler world.
Yes.
So they can establish that first.
Exactly.
And so you're saying, okay. So it's a slightly different argument, perhaps, because I said, well, a narrative is a description of an ethic. And you say there's more ways that the world needs to be apprehended than the purely narrative.
Yes.
And I think that's fine. But does that bear on the argument that the description of an ethic is a narrative?
No, because we also describe other ways in which we prioritize our perceptions in things that aren't narratives, that are nomological. That's what we call a scientific theory. The theory of evolution, right, is not a narrative. It's a description of the way things unfold. Or let's say Newton's laws. Newton's laws are not narrative in any fashion. But
do you think? Okay, so let me push back on that. Fair enough. And then you could say, well, a set of mathematical axioms and the operations that are derived from the axioms is also not a narrative. And fair enough. So then I would say, and this will get us into discussion about science later, is the intelligibility and the attraction of those non-narrative descriptions of the world dependent on their being nested inside a narrative?
But see, and so here's where I'm going to answer you back. I'm going to say they reciprocally require each other. Just like what we were doing with the true and the good and the beautiful.
Okay, so then fine. So is that the same thing as narrative and the scientific description mutually requiring each other?
Right, but you can't reduce the one to the either to the. You can't reduce one.
Okay.
You can't reduce the nomological to the narrative or the narrative to the nomological. That's what I was trying to get at 3 dimensions, almost like a Cartesian graph with 3 dimensions. Right.
Okay.
You can't reduce if I remove.
Right. Because I suppose if you do that too, you run into the postmodern trap, which is that there's nothing but the narrative intelligibility. There's nothing but the narrative.
There has to, yes. And there also has to be something. There has to be a space within which we can compare narratives, move between narratives, and learn narratives. Right. And there has to be something that allows us to override narrative bias. You know, the research on narrative bias. It's powerful. It's one of our most powerful bias. There has to be something that can kick us out of the narrative bias.
So, but I think the way the way that I would phrase it is that the reason why we tend to think, or like even the way that I present it, is that the priority of narrative is because narrative is the embodied manner in which we engage with a structure of values. That is, it's the way that we engage in a structure of values. And so because we see and usually it has
is a narrative that embodied pattern is a description of the embodied pattern.
I think that it's
because I don't know if it's a story if you act it out. I don't know if it's a story until it's a representation of a pattern of actions, because otherwise it's more like a pattern of behavior, like, so for example, imagine you watched wolves interacting.
Yeah.
You could say, well, it's as if they're following the following narrative rules, but they're not, because they don't have, it's not narrative. It's a pattern in their behavior.
Right. But for the same reason that it's the through line, like for the same reason that you can't see the glass from the elements of the glass, it doesn't mean that the glassness, like the identity of the glass, has a causal relationship to its elements. It's just not it's not a mechanical causal relationship. It's a causal of identity. And so the narrative, or let's say the pattern of behavior, is causal from above, you could say, because it's the way in which you recognize that the behavior is a pattern in the first place.
Right.
Okay. I want to push back on you.
All right. No, you have to. You have to, John.
This is one of the areas where we
kind of don't totally agree.
But that's good, because
well, this is a real mystery, this problem, because it is the relationship between science and the narrative of meaning. It's a relationship between ontology and epistemology, or between description and value. I mean, so it's no wonder that this is causing, a little bit of trouble.
So I want to throw in one more dimension, which is you can also level up in a game. There's a way there's a dimension that's not a narrative. It's an act of self-transcendence, right?
I thought of that as a meta-narrative
that you can scale in a game. That has to be.
That's Quidditch, by the way. That's what Rowling represented with Quidditch, because there's a game and a metagame.
Oh.
And if you win the metagame, you also win the game.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not vice versa, which is it's so smart. So, sorry.
You do this, Jordan. You'll just throw out these observations that are like,
it's even worse than that, because the thing that the Quidditch players are chasing is the round chaos of alchemy that contains all the potential of the world.
Right.
And it's also the spirit of Mercury. It's like, I don't know how she did that. It's just beyond belief that she managed that. I really don't know how she did that.
Yeah. It's like the way to understand it, like in terms of a glass, would be like, once you grasp the logos, this is a St. Maximus way of speaking too. Once you grasp the logos, then you are able to, you've captured all the rules and everything else. But once you understand what a glass is, then you don't have to, you can recognize every glass in the entire world. It's like, it's such a massive power. You overcome the entire game through getting this one thing, which is often imaged as a seed or as a golden ball or as something sparkling, which you represent like in the world, but is ultimately pointing above it.
Well, that's perhaps that's reflected in the insistence that Adam is to name all the animals, right? In the story of Adam and Eve, because that's obviously kept in the narrative for a reason. And it has to do with the power that naming and subduing, in the sense that you've described, which is the also simultaneous imposition of a hierarchy of categorization that goes along with naming, that gives you a grip on the world. And that grip is associated with a moral necessity and requirement in that story.
It's, for me, the nomological dimension is the naming dimension.
Mm-hmm.
That's what science does, broadly construed. Yeah. And that's different from telling a story. Naming things is different from telling a story.
So but ultimately, this is where I kind of come back again to the conscious.
We'll keep doing this.
We have to not go too far into this because we've been through this down this path before. But so ultimately, because we are not disembodied beings, like this is, so science, this type of nonological order is taken from a position where I am, as I see the nonological order, I have to climb the ladder. And so, especially most narratives always have a sense of,
this is Moses on the mountain again.
Yes. But that's why the narrative is always this. Like almost all narratives are that. It's you notice the difference. And once you notice the distance, and when you notice the distance, then you have to reestablish a connection with that, with which you're distant. Because you don't need an ethic unless you notice the difference. You don't need an explicit ethic. You don't have to
Why
spell it out.
not unless you notice the difference?
Because you don't have to tell someone how to go downstairs unless they can't do it. You don't have an explicit set of rules.
Okay, so there has to be an objection. There has to be a problem.
So St. Paul says something like, okay, the law is written on the human heart, which means that it doesn't mean all the laws are written extensively in every detail in the human heart. That is in the human heart, in that little golden ball, in that center, in that place where everything comes together, you contain all the potentiality. Everything that has the through line is contained in that. But now if you notice the difference, then you have to formulate that difference. And then that becomes the laws or just the ways of being. So I can say something at first like, when you're driving a car, like there's specific laws, and then a problem comes up. It's like, actually, there's a differentiation here which we have to make, or else there's a problem.
Right,
so
which means the ethic that's
and
currently...
it just keeps getting more and more detailed and more and more. So you start with the law, you end up with like this, let's say in Jewish tradition, you end up with this huge compendium of exceptions and like details and everything.
Sure.
But ultimately, the idea is that all of that is ultimately contained in something which gathers it all together into this ineffable point that transcends.
I like all of this, but the space in which all the laws are being made and written, that's not a narrative space, right?
So let me go after you on that for a minute.
The Ten Commandments is not a story.
Because right? I don't think that's true.
You think
that? I think it is a story. That's why that's a good entry point. Okay. That's a good entry point.
Well, there's a story which reveals the Ten Commandments.
Right, but
there's also a story in it. The Ten Commandments aren't, I believe there is a little bit. But I think you're right. But this is why we say that the Ten Commandments is embedded in a story. Without the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, finding themselves in a desert of nothingness, having to reconnect with the transcendent, that is why the law exists. And so the nonological order is embedded in the story. You wouldn't have to.
But the reverse is also the case.
Go ahead.
If God doesn't offer us the nomological order, there's no point for the Exodus in the story. Right. Right.
That's okay. We could hypothesize that it comes up from the bottom and down from the top.
This is even before that.
Yeah. Right. We're trying to talk about, I'm proposing that the narrative and the nomological and whatever we want to call this self-transcending dimension are irreducible to each other. None of them can exist independent. That's why I'm using the 3 dimensions metaphor. Yeah. Right. They are interdependent, but they're not reducible. So I'm resisting the hypothesis.
I would say that the ontology is not captured inside epistemology because epistemology cannot reach to the full extent of the multiplicity of ontology. So now why is that relevant to what you just said? That's part of the irreducibility. You're arguing, I think, in some sense that no matter what the story is, there's something that's real that's beyond that story. Is that okay? So let me put a couple of twists in that. Got it.
Is that okay for you, Jonathan, right now?
No, I think it's fine. We'll keep going.
Okay. So you said there's no story in the Ten Commandments, right? And Jonathan had one objection. I have a different take on that he may appreciate. Maybe you too. When the Pharisees and the scribes are always trying to trap Christ in the Gospels into making a heretical statement or doing something that clearly violates the law. So they call him on healing on the Sabbath, for example. Yes. And there's like 10 stories like that where smart people who run on algorithms try to trap him. And it never works because he does the thing you described, which is he just refers to a higher order principle or even 3 levels up and says like, no.
Yes.
But one of the things that happens is the Pharisees come and say, well, here's the Decalogue. Which is the most important law? And the trick there is no matter what he says the others are less important. And so now he's a heretic and they get to take him away. And he says, put God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of the laws are derived from that spirit. And that spirit is a story. And that story is the Logos. And so
that's the move that I don't want to slow it down, Jordan.
Okay.
Expand that up. I get that's the spirit. I totally get that.
Well, then the question is, what is the spirit?
But why is the spirit necessarily a story?
Well, I don't know why it's necessarily a story, but I know that it's necessarily a story in that context because the spirit that Christ is referring to that unites the Decalogue is the Logos. And the whole biblical corpus, the narrative that spans the entire biblical corpus is the account of the elaboration of that spirit across time and its embodied incarnation. And that presents itself as a story. And I think the reason for that is that it just, okay, I mean, I understand your point. I understand the point that you're making now. And so,
I'm actually understanding your point better than I've ever understood it before.
Yeah, right.
Because
well, you're talking about that which transcends the current narrative, and that has to be there, or there's no reality. So, okay, let's leave that for a moment.
No, I just want to maybe one more thing because I think it's important. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I think we're at a key moment. So
we are.
So one of the things that we've been discussing, and this has been coming back over and over, is that let's say that we understand that there is a certain type of equivalence and two functions for a nomological order, like a hierarchy that's presented, like just a series of categories which are related in embedded structure, right?
And I see science committed to that.
Right.
Okay.
And that this also coexists. For sure, in scripture, that's what we're seeing is like it coexists together. It's like you have the story of the Israelites in the Bible, and then you have these series of laws, which is actually not just 10. It's a lot of laws, right? So you have all these laws. And so, but one of the things that you've said several times is that you feel like the solution to the meaning crisis doesn't need narrative, or that narrative shouldn't be part of the solution. And so I think that if those two both have their function, let's say, why is it that you want to remove one and keep the other?
No, okay. That's an excellent question.
This is something Sam Harris struggles with too, by the way. No, I'm dead serious about that. I'm dead serious about that.
So let me answer this really carefully and tell me if we're getting too far afield from the main discussion, okay? So I'm going to depend on both of you.
Yeah.
My argument is the nomological order that one of the problems of the meaning crisis is the nomological order that we have is no longer in any way relatable to or can be wedded to a narrative. Because the nomological order we have, right, is that so what used to bridge between the nomological order and the narrative order is teleology. So teleology says the nomological order is ordered, but it's ordered in this way. And the teleology has this structure. And then narrative says, oh, I can glom onto, I can conform to a teleological order because stories are inherently teleological. But they're different from just a teleology. Just telling a teleology isn't a story, but stories can attach to teleology. Is that?
Yeah. Why is describing a teleology not a story? Because you could describe you could describe the cup, but then the problem is, well, can you describe the cup in the absence of a narrative? And I mean, I think part of the argument I'm trying to make in this, so this is our key disagreement in some senses. I don't think you can.
Okay.
And so,
well, let's be really careful because we might also be engaged in semantic drift.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to limit, like we can trivialize what we mean by narrative. And any description of a series of events is a narrative. Okay.
Yeah. No. Okay. I don't want to do that. I get your point. No. We don't want to widen the words so much that the argument.
Wait a minute though. But wait a minute. No. I would actually object to that because any descriptions of events that I can conceive as being one has to have some kind of narrative structure.
Otherwise, we have the problem of
we have the same problem of multiplicity. And combinatorial exposure. If I can recognize that events connect together,
that opens up. That means that you have to not metaphorically.
I agree with that.
But well, let me challenge it though.
Unfortunately,
and I'm not speaking metaphorically here because if I'm speaking metaphorically, we're just off in another thing. That means that music has a narrative because it has a melody. You're saying a melody is a narrative, and that strikes me as a very improper thing to say.
That's a tough one, man.
Yeah.
Because then you have to start to wrestle with, well, what do you mean by music? Because you could say that the sequence of the notes in and of itself may not have a narrative, although I'm not certain of that, but you could say that but then the question is, when you're listening to the music and it has the effect that you regard as music on you, how much of that effect, including the aesthetic, is a consequence of a narrative? So I would say, well, when you say music, how sure are you that what you're saying is that's nothing but the relationship of the notes to one another?
I agree. That's a good point.
Because there's no embodiment in that, right?
Right. And there's a sense in which music is neither subjective or objective, but
right, like beauty.
Yes.
But it has to have something that is at least analogous to narrative, because in order for you to recognize, and it's funny because the moderns tried to go away from that. You can understand. The moderns really tried to break it. But there was, in any traditional society, there are tropes of music which help you understand when something's beginning, when something's ending. And
you can map them onto narrative very directly, because that's what happens.
Okay, but then I'm going to slide you, because if you give me you say, I'm going to extend narrative to melody, then I'll say, here's a logical argument, and there's a progression and a through line from the premises to the conclusion. Is that a narrative?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a tough one, right? Because the fact that you selected out those okay. Here's something I've been thinking about. I'm going to take a slight detour, but go right back to the point. So I thought about this more when I was talking to Richard Dawkins, because I think Dawkins is a good faith player, and I think he believes, he's a real scientist, and he believes that the truth will set you free, which scientists have to believe to be scientists, because they cannot be scientists if they're not pursuing the truth.
The truth is sacred to Dawkins.
Absolutely.
He won't admit that, but it is.
Okay, so I was thinking about the scientific endeavor, and I thought a lot about this when I was reading Jung's work on alchemy, because Jung attempted to situate the development of science in this alchemical fantasy. And it's a very interesting piece of work. So he believes that there was this immense motivated narrative that provided the historical precondition in the realm of unconscious fantasy for the flourishing of science. So it's an amazing argument. In any case, thinking about that, I thought, well, there's a set of facts, and that's kind of the argument you're making. There's a set of facts independent of the narrative. And that's kind of the scientific viewpoint. There's a set of facts independent of the narrative. And even more importantly, we should identify the set of facts that's maximally independent of any narrative, because why should your facts prevail? And we want a universal set of facts. And fine, look what we've got with that. But then I think, wait a second, when you're practically engaged in the processes of science, the sort of things that Kuhn tried to lay out, is it not the case that you're always engaged within a system of practice and perception that's defined by at least an implicit if-then statement? And so I would say, if this is your aim, then that's the set of relevant and true facts.
Conditional implications.
Well, yeah. Well, so if you're a medical researcher, it's like, well, here's what the cancer cell is doing. Well, what do you mean doing? Because it's doing an infinite number of things. Oh, well, if we want to understand the cancer cell so that we can eradicate cancer, then this is what the cancer cell is doing. Sure. Now, it's also doing something that's independent of that narrative. But the weird thing about that is that it's doing such a plethora of things independent of that narrative that you drown in the complexity.
Of course.
So then we have a problem here, right? Is that they have the facts of the cancer cell, which are multiplicitous. Then you have the set of relevant facts, which hopefully are still facts, but those aren't derivable without the narrative that we should save lives, that saving lives is good, that we can pay careful attention to the horrors of disease in the attempt to ameliorate suffering. All of that framework seems to be a precondition for the abstraction of the relevant facts.
I agree with everything you said.
Okay.
What I disagreed with was the identity statement you slipped in, which is the ethic is a narrative. That's exactly what's in dispute here. The dispute isn't that we don't need these normative structures. I'm not disputing that at all. What I'm disputing is that they're all reducible to the narrative ethic.
Right.
That there's also a nomological ethic.
Right. Well, that's also why I wanted to get to the last three parts of this. So
I think that I'm coming closer to you than ever because
this is wonderful.
In the sense that, because I need to work it out, but because I see that in, like, let's say that there is clearly a distinction in the story Like in the story, there is a story and then there's the laws, and they're related, but they're different. And so I need to think about why they're related.
Well, one of the
why
things,
they have to be related.
Well, there's an interesting weirdness there that's also associated with the scientific enterprise, because one of the things you're trying to do, imagine if you impose a strict narrative that there's a very limited set of facts that make themselves manifest. Well, what you want to do scientifically is say, well, let's abstract out the set of relevant facts in a manner that's relevant to a multitude of redemptive narratives simultaneously.
Okay, so let me pick up on that. So let me try and, using what we've just said, specify the difference, how I would put it. I think what science does is it picks up on nomological relations, which are supposed to be, as you say, causal invariants for the universe, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. We'll forget Einstein.
Right.
Everywhere.
Across narratives.
Right. A narrative is not about causal laws. A narrative is about an irrepeatable causal pathway. When I ask, why did Napoleon lose at Waterloo? I don't give you a law. I give you a narrative. Narratives are, this event leads to this event. It's a through line, like you said, but it's a through line that explains the specific occurrence of specific events. It's exactly the opposite, to my mind, of what science does. Science is trying to explain the universality that is not captured in the specifics of a specific causal pathway. That's why I can't see.
So imagine this. You have so there's this notion in the Old Testament. There's a sequence of stories. So it's an aggregation of stories. And there's an idea that the meta narrative of Christ is implicit in that set of narratives.
Yes.
And so then I have this idea. Well, and Jung talked about this as well, said, imagine you take any random sample of narratives, comprehensive random sample of narratives, and you attempt to extract out the common story. It's going to be an image of something like Christ. You could even say that that's what Christ is in some sense. So, and we can argue about that, but it's like saying that the hero narrative is archetypal. It's the same idea. If you have 25 narratives and you see what makes them interesting adventure stories, it's the hero archetype.
So the reason why you can recognize it as a through line in the first place is because it has a pattern.
But that's my point. My point is, just like the through line of all the aspects is not an aspect, the through line of all the stories is not itself a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I'm not so sure. That is definitely what we're arguing about. And I'm not saying I know this. There may be a distinction between a story and the pattern of all stories. And maybe that's something we can think about too, because in my work in Maps of Meaning, I called just a narrative a story, but the story that unites all narratives is a meta story. And Piaget cottoned onto this too, in some sense, because he started to try to find out what kids regarded as true. And then by the end of his career, he said, well, what we really want to know if we're studying truth isn't the nature of any contingent truths. So any representations within a system, narrative or otherwise, but the process, we need to specify the process by which all truths come to be as the ultimate truth. And then I would say that the meta narrative that constitutes Christ from the symbolic perspective is the story of the process by which, what would we say? It's certainly the story of the process by which narratives transform. It's not exactly a story because it's a meta story. It's the problem of this kind of apophatic move, this kenotic reality, which is true also of the nomological order as well. That is, the origin of the nomological order is not a nomological order.
Exactly.
In the same way that the origin of a narrative is not a detailed narrative per se. The patterns all move into the manner in which they transcend themselves and ultimately give up to this apophatic, this negative space or negative reality.
And I think the nomological and the narrative and what this self-transcending dimension, they all converge.
Right.
I
totally agree with that.
So imagine this.
But that's not to say they're identical.
No, of course they're not, because that's why they converge.
Right. I think if they were so obviously identical, we wouldn't have a conflict between science and religion, which we apparently have. So it's an important distinction. So imagine you have this set of narratives that are particularized, and out of that you extract a general pattern, and the pattern is something akin to the process of adaptation itself, which is the manifestation of the divine word, let's say, and its ability to call order out of chaos. So you got this hierarchy of narratives, and there's something at the pinnacle. And so then imagine that you have a set of corresponding facts, and each specific narrative would give you a set of proximal facts, but there's an abstraction from the facts that approximates universal scientific truths. But I would say that maybe they exist in relationship to the application of that meta-narrative. Because isn't it the case, now I don't know, I can't figure this out. Isn't it the case that we abstract out commonalities, like force equals mass times acceleration, because we want to further our adaptation to the world?
Yeah.
As simultaneously, we're exploring the intrinsic logos of ontology. But we've already agreed to some degree that there's a similitude between that ontology and the epistemology.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe as we abstract out from scientific truths towards the universal, not only must we simultaneously move up the abstraction level in a narrative sense, Jung's point would be we better or will misuse the nomological to destroy ourselves.
Wouldn't that also be the case if we abstracted up the narrative without also going up the nomological?
He
That's
believed,
Plato's argument.
He believed that the problem with the first millennia of Christianity was that we did exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
Was that we emphasized spiritual redemption to such a degree, try to reduce redemption itself to the spiritual, then the world was still crying out because of its ontological suffering. It's like, well, if we're all redeemed by the sacrifice of Christ, it's like, what's with all the poor and diseased people? And that call for the unredeemed material was part of what he saw as the motivational foundation for the systematic investigation, say, that led to the development of medicine. Yeah. So there was an insufficiency. Maybe it's the insufficiency of getting lost in epistemology. If it's just a narrative, it's just a narrative. Well, it's not. It has to refer to the world. Okay, so, that complicates things, right? Because we're part of what we're stuck on here to some degree is in that ontological realm that's outside any given narrative, there is also a logos. And then the question is that ontological logos, the nature of the world itself, somehow a narrative? And the Christian idea to answer that would be, I don't know, because creation is separate from God.
Creation, speaking on behalf of Christianity, but I think Christianity makes the claim that the logos is ultimately a person, not a narrative.
It's not a story. Yeah. That's very important.
Right.
The logos is not a story. Everything culminates into the person.
And person literally means, originally means hypostasis, that which stands under.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Well, it has to be a person, right? Right. But that's why I also said, though, that it's the description of a structure of values is a narrative. So as an embodied ideal, Christ isn't a story.
No.
Right. But the description of his embodiment, that's a story. And the images are a story. And the reason we want the story is because the story calls us to the ethic. That's why we value the stories, is right. I would like to see the world the way you see it, because you have a whole set of tools that I don't have. And so if you can tell me a story and I can enter into your world, then that is truly redemptive, because the facts now array themselves in a slightly different way that might be very valuable to me if I run into one of these objects that you described. You know, I'm running an algorithm and something objects. So I don't know what to do. What would you do? Tell me what you did in the similar situation. And so I don't think the story isn't God, that gets so tricky. The Christian emphasis certainly is that the embodied reality is the fundamental reality.
Yes.
Yeah, but the story isn't nothing. That's for sure.
I'm not saying that.
I know you're not. I know you're not.
I'm not saying that at all. I was trying to answer Jonathan's question, right? And we're running into the difficulty that I see. Whether or not I'm right or wrong, there's a difficulty.
Oh,
here.
Definitely.
And that's the difficulty I'm putting my finger on. I'm trying to put my finger on in the meeting.
Well, it's also the difficulty that I'm trying to address with this set of propositions. It's definitely a difficulty. Okay, but we got somewhere in that, I would say.
I think it was very valuable.
Okay, so I'm going to skip to number 5 here. Every set of values is hierarchical. Otherwise, there's no prioritization. I think we agree on that, because we've already agreed that there has to be a prioritization, and
there has to be.
That implies a hierarchy.
So the one thing I wanted to ask there, sorry, I seem to be the devil's advocate here.
No.
Right? But is again, let's go back to embodied living. And this is actually something you see in narratives. And I would also say that it's something that some of the parables of Jesus point to. Because parables, I think McFag is right. Parables are narratives that destroy themselves as narrative structures. They're kind of like the way koans destroy themselves as questions. And so what I want to say is, let's say that there is, we seem to have like there's the true, the good, and the beautiful, or we have the narrative, the nomological, and I'll call it the normative in terms of betterment or something. Like let's say, is it the case? Is the hierarchy stable? What I mean by that is you get narratives, you get stories, you get works of art, great works of art, in which it looks like they're picking up on something that is true to our embodied experiences. Sometimes we sacrifice the true for the good, or the good for the beautiful, or the beautiful for the true. Like we seem to be making trade-off. We don't seem to have a stable what's on top. We shift the prioritizations around. There's a lot of great art, at least proposing that. So I think it's a reasonable thing to
Right.
consider.
Well, I think that's partly a consequence of the confusion about what constitutes the unification. So part of the project I have here is that I'm beginning to view all the narratives that are laid out in the biblical corpus as they're snapshots of a different idea of what should be at the top.
They're like the through line.
Yeah, well, they're representations of the through line. We still don't know what the through line is, so to speak, right? But they're snapshots. So for example, in the opening lines of Genesis, God, so we'll say, by definition, God is what is at the top. We'll just start with that. And I'm not going to make an ontological claim about that. Just an epistemological claim. God is what's at the top of your value structure.
Right.
Okay, so what should that be? Well, let's say that's a mystery. Okay, so the Bible is an attempt to represent that mystery from a variety of different narrative perspectives. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. So in the earliest chapter, the beginning of Genesis, God is the Word that derives the habitable order that is good out of chaos and potential.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's whatever God is, that's part of it. Okay, so that's and God is a creative force. And then there's the next thing is that God is whatever it is that human beings are made in the image of. That also provides them with a worth that transcends the merely material in some sense, because God is outside creation. And if man is made in the image of God, then there's something about man that's valuable, that's outside of the mere materiality. Okay, so that's the next proposition. And then God is rapidly that which forbids and allows. So that happens in the garden. And then God is that spirit that you walk with when you're unself-conscious and not ashamed. So that's the story of Adam in the garden. And then in Noah, God is that which calls you to batten down the hatches and prepare when, if you're wise in your generations, you see that chaos is coming. And then in the Abrahamic story, God is that which calls you out of the comfort of your family into adventure. And so it's like click, 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 click. And it's, who knows what the union of all those things are, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're quite multiplicitous.
Very.
But I think they're very sophisticated. And you might say, well, is that God? It's like, well, do you follow the call of adventure? Do you take your own intuition seriously when you think that the flood is coming? The answer to that generally is, well, you either follow that or you're in trouble. You sure know that. And is God the divine word that generates habitable order, the habitable order that is good out of chaos? Well, do you believe that truth has that power? So I think, okay, so these are all ways of pointing to that which might unify the disunity that you see. Now, you can't boil it down in some way, the same way that you boil down beauty. You know, it's harder to specify. And I think what the Bible is attempting to do, and I think this is true of religious writings of many sorts, is what is it? It's a characterization of this. First of all, it's an insistence that the thing at the top is a spirit, right? It's not an idea. It's not even like beauty. It's not an abstraction. It's a spirit that can inhabit, which is kind of the incarnation idea. So it's a spirit that you can embody, or that can seize and possess you. So it's really something that's living. And so it's not merely an abstract idea, and it's not just a nomological construct. Mm-hmm. It's something you enact. Mm-hmm. And it's something, in principle, you might think, well, and this leads to the next point, any hierarchy that is not unified produces confusion, anxiety, anomie, aimlessness, and conflict, psychological and social. Well, why? Well, if it's not unified, you don't know your priorities. Mm-hmm. And if it isn't pointing to something valuable, there's no hope, because hope is to be found in the movement towards something of value. So, okay, well, sorry, that's a lot.
No, but that's helpful. So let me say something, and it's not really a pushback, but it's sliding over here. And if we can make the connection, then maybe we can come to an agreement around it. So, right. Adaptivity. Adaptivity is a thing, and it's really important, and it's not an abstraction.
Define it.
Adaptivity is that you are fitted to your environment in a way that allows you to successfully live long enough to reproduce. Right?
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of an iterated game idea too. You have to live long enough to propagate.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. And I'm not here to defend, a gene version or a group selection version. That's not what I want to.
Yep.
Okay. So adaptivity, and you want to, how does this arise? And one of the things you can do is you can say, here's all these snapshots of adaptivity. Mm-hmm. And what I can do is I can try and find what do they all share in common?
The capacity to elicit awe.
Well, wait a second. Wait a second. So like the problem is, right, this is what you see the naturalists before Darwin doing. They're trying to find the shared perfection.
Yeah.
And then Darwin breaks the mold. He says, no, you're making the mistake. There is no, right? Right. There isn't. What there is, right, is some things are adaptive because they're small. Some are adaptive because they're large. Some are fast. Some are slow. Some are hard. Some are soft. Some are unicellular. Some are multicellular. Adaptivity doesn't have, but what he finds is, but there's a universal process that is, right, that can explain how all of these different snapshots emerge.
But there is a perfection, and the perfection is being itself. It's the continuation of existence.
Okay, but what you just did, you've played. You're not playing with my analogy, though.
Right.
You said I can meta that, and I'm not denying that you can do that, Jonathan. I'm trying to use a meta. I'm trying to use an analogy. I don't deny that. Yeah. Okay, I'm not making that claim. I'm just trying to use this as an analogy, and I'm trying to say.
Right. Well, it's a powerful objection because certainly the biologists do that. They say, well, there's no teleology in evolution, and I know that you object to that because you say, well, there has to be because you can't even. There's no unity there in any of the organisms, and there's certainly no way of perceiving them. But they also have a point, which is...
There's a nomological unity, even though there's no narrative. That's how they argue it. There is a universal process that can be understood scientifically that explains adaptivity. Because if you get the theory of evolution, you say, right, all the organisms should be different.
But then you have the problem that every organism that survives plays out a pattern, which is variation on the horizon of potentiality. And so then you might say, well, there is a directionality because if the organism can't vary creatively on the horizon of potentiality, it can't exist or multiply. And so then, so there's a teleology that emerges out of the necessity for survival and reproduction. And so, I would say, think about, sorry, I gotta get this out.
I'll shut up.
The abstractions you generate in your prefrontal cortex are avatars of the process of adaptation to the horizon of the future. And so the flowering of the human spirit in its highest sense is an embodiment of the process by which the biologists attribute the adaptivity. It's the process that underlies adaptivity. And so maybe those things dovetail.
Well, that's what I'm going to say.
But so there is a narrative though.
No. There's where I want to challenge you. You gave me a model of the logos that I would say is not narrative, except for a trivial definition of narrative, which is variation and selection. And look, instead, let's put it back in the psychological
It's
domain.
like with humans, it's the willingness to do that though. So it's not just the fact that it can happen and does happen. And that's partly what brings in the narrative element is you do not have to abide by that. Like that can happen to you. You can have this creative variation and this selection in relationship to adaptivity, let's say, to keep it biological. But you do not have to do that. And so I think it's the struggle with that constitutes the narrative.
I want to push back on you on that. Because I think there's all kinds of stuff at Relevance Realization doing that variation and selection that you cannot exercise authority over because your authority actually depends on the right. So it's different than the level at which you have narrative access to your own being. And I
think that's related to Jonathan's objection earlier, that the law is inscribed on the human heart. It's like, yes, I agree, but let me say, if I claim that human evolution builds a material embodiment that strives towards manifestation of the logos. And then there's an abstraction.
That's fine.
And that meets in the middle. The fact that you can't control all the manifestations of your prioritization structure doesn't mean the logos isn't built into the a priori systems that structure that perception for you.
I'm not denying that. What I'm denying is that logos is ultimately operating as a narrative. I think and look at even psychologically. Narrative doesn't emerge until a certain age, and it depends on dialogos. It depends on dialogue. It depends on joint attention. It depends on the ability to take turns in conversation. You have to have all this dialogical machinery in place before narrative is possible.
Right. Well, the way I would object to that, fine, that's a perfectly reasonable objection. But the problem with that is that a lot of that's scaffolded by quasi-narrative precursors. So, for example, one of the things you do with a baby before it can engage in the dialogos verb-mediated semantically is you do a dance-like play. And the spirit of the logos is, and I would say a narrative spirit is deeply embodied in that, because if that isn't taking place within the spirit of love and play and truth, then it isn't going to give rise to the capacity later for the dialogos. So that's kind of the embedment, in some sense, of the embedding. There's the word of the logos in the material. Right, prior to its manifestation. And I do think in some sense that's not a story, because if you watch a wolf pack, what they're doing isn't a story. But if you describe it, it becomes a story.
Yes.
Right? So there is an embodied pattern that's not a story. But
I think we're agreeing now then.
Okay. Well, there's a lot.
So I guess we go back to where you said the description of a structure of values.
That's right. I said the description is a story. Now, that doesn't mean that the description doesn't match the underlying behavioral pattern. I think one of the things I sort of thought through in Maps of Meaning with the Moses story is, well, why those laws? So you see, in the story, it's so bloody cool. Before Moses goes up to the mountain, he spends decades, we don't know, forever, morning to night, judging objections. So the Israelites are out in the desert, there's no structure, and they fight with each other all the time. Mm-hmm. And then they come to Moses and say, well, we're fighting. What do we do about it? And he judges them. And his father-in-law actually says to him, you have to stop doing this because it is absolutely exhausting you. And it isn't until after that, so then you think, what's he doing? Well, he's seeing all these micro-narratives, right? And then he has to discriminate between them, which means he's turning them into a hierarchy of value, because that's what the discrimination is. This is what's right in this conflict. So conflict, hierarchy. And then he's doing that just constantly. So you can imagine that within him, this hierarchy of value is starting to be built explicitly. Then he goes up on the mountain and it's like, bang! Oh, this is what all our striving is oriented to. And then he comes down. The first time it doesn't map, as you said. The second time it maps. So the deliverance of the message from on high has to map onto this. And some of this conflict and its agreement would emerge from biological acceptability, because the people would say, oh, I feel as though that was just. It solves the problem. And so the material is in communication then with the abstraction.
I think we're close to agreement. I guess to circle back, I don't sort of deny that. I'm really not denying that narrative is a powerful way for disclosing intelligibility and the logos, right? What I'm saying is there's a privileging of it here that I don't.
Okay, so is it important? Is it important? Is the distinction that I just made between an embodied pattern and a narrative enough to dispense with your objection, or is there more to it?
Well, let me see, because I think that theories and poems and music, things that I'm treating as non-narrative, can disclose depths of reality that I can't disclose with a story.
Okay, so why is it important to you or necessary to make that distinction, do you think? Just out of curiosity.
Why it's important for me is that I'm concerned about a privileging of narrative. I'll use biblical language.
An inappropriate privileging of narrative.
That will border on idolatry, right? In that we are...
Well, that's kind of what the postmodernists do. So there's definitely a danger there, right? If you overprivilege narrative to the point where the ontology itself disappears.
But I think what John is saying is that he's afraid that if we embrace a narrative, then the solution to the meaning crisis won't be universal enough. Is that something?
So that's a practical implication, because I would propose to you, it's a proposal, okay, that whatever is going to resolve the meaning crisis has to reintegrate science and spirituality. If it does not do that in some
so that's partly also what you're insisting on, is that there is this domain of scientific knowledge that should be regarded as in some sense independent of narrative. And I'm still having a very much trouble with that because we still have the problem of if then, right? It's like, but I don't see how we escape from that.
But that's where I push on back on the trivialization. If then constitutes a narrative.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
If constitutes a narrative.
If constitutes.
Yeah, if does, because if has to be, well, if we want to cure disease, if we want to. So Jung believed that the spirit of science grew out of the alchemical fantasy. And so the alchemical fantasy was, we will find in material the solution to ill health, death, and privation. Well, yeah, ill health, death, and privation. That's exactly it. And so Jung's point was, without that impulse, which he regarded as a compensation to the hyper-spiritualization that Christianity imposed in the world in the first Christian Ion, without that fantasy deeply embodied, manifesting itself out of embodied behavior and then out of image, we wouldn't have been, because Jung said, well, how do you get someone to look down a microscope at an amoeba for 10 hours? Because no animal will do that. And his notion was, well, we had to be gripped by something of a dream of intense motivational significance. And it was the dream that redemption could be found in analysis of the transformations of the material world.
Right. But the motivating structure is not the same thing as the referent of what I'm talking about. Right. So I might need narrative to do science, but we don't want to make the genetic fallacy that means that everything that science is referring to is a narrative, right?
Yeah,
the fact that'd be like, that's like saying everything I talk about, I have to speak in English. So reality is made out of English.
That does bring us to the postmodern conundrum, because they would insist that no, all the facts that science derives are in some simple sense a narrative, right? And then that narrative is associated with the drive to power and domination. And so, yeah, we do have to be careful of that, because we'll fall right into that trap.
Right. So that's what, so if you think.
You got a comment?
No, but
sorry.
Can I say this? I do think that a great manner in which modern science got developed I think it is narrative. That is, there is, on the one hand, the desire to deliver, but on the other hand, the desire to dominate is there, right? Mm-hmm. We've talked about this before with Bacon.
I don't deny that.
Yeah. And so and so it doesn't take away
but the same motivation can drive people in doing mathematics. Yeah. Right? It's the same motivation can drive people doing music. So we don't want to say that's the essence of science or music or mathematics, because then we're removing the important differences.
You're afraid that we're collapsing everything.
Yes.
Into narrative. But I think that it's mostly about hierarchy in the sense that because we are embodied beings that are living in the world, that are living lives, then all that we do, all that we care about is part of that reality. And so even the nomological order, although I think I agree with you now, it's definitely not a narrative.
Right.
But it is embedded. That's why Jordan used the expression embedded in narrative.
Yes.
That is, that it has to.
But isn't the reverse the case? Narrative depends on the presupposition that there is an ordered world in which it can take place.
Right. But the question is then, is that logos that constitutes the order, so to speak, if when you represent that, do you necessarily represent it as a narrative? And this is a deep question. I mean,
I'm proposing to you that the logos is that which allows the narrative order and the nomological order
to unite,
do what they're doing. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. But that's fine. But then I might wonder, does it extend to the narrative order and to the underlying ontological order as well?
The logos is both in the story and in the logic. We think about, just even follow the history of the word logos and watch how it goes in these two different directions with good reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so then the question, so you're objecting that the logos isn't a story. And that's so strange. And it's so weird, because we could say that the West is kind of split on that, because in some sense, if you think of the development of the idea of the logos from the Greek and Enlightenment side, the answer would be there's no immediate insistence there that it's a narrative.
That's right.
But on the Judeo Christian side, there's a pronounced insistence that it's a narrative.
Yes.
And our modern culture is actually a union of those two, right?
You've just described a couple episodes of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. That's exactly the argument I try to trace out.
And certainly the argument we're having right now, because Jonathan and I, in some sense, are making a case for the logos as narrative and embodied narrative, although you also point to the importance of embodiment.
I'm not rejecting
I know. Well, it's very difficult to differentiate this, right?
Yes.
And I do like the idea that there's a hierarchy of narrative with the ideal at the top, and then a hierarchy of nomological description, and that there's a correspondence between the hierarchies, because it does seem to me that, and I want to puzzle that out. One of the things Jung warned about, he thought there was an ethos in the religious story and to some degree in the alchemical story. And then when the scientific revolution hit, we blew up the nomological into this massively powerful thing, but our ethic was left in the same primitive form. And so now we're in danger because of that.
I think that's exactly right. I think I talk about this in terms of propositional tyranny and algorithmic tyranny.
Right.
And what we've done is we've reduced the logos inappropriately to logic. I strongly resist that move too.
Right. So you're okay. Well, I get your caution, because I do believe that devolving everything down to the narrative per se does put us in the postmodern trap, which is, it's all, in some sense, it's all narrative, which is kind of what they claimed. And that's a problem, because then you can dispense with the corrective reality.
Exactly. Yeah. So I use a stereoscopic metaphor. I think of the logos as epitomized in logic, as in story, and then I try to look through both to a depth. That's what I try to think of as the logos.
Okay, tell me that again.
So you know how I have the left and right visual field, and then I look through them to depth perception.
Yeah.
Here's logos as logic. Here's logos as story, and I try to look through them to the depth behind them.
Yeah. That seems on the face of it quite fine. I mean, I'm still in a conundrum, because we already agreed that the selection of the facts and even the manifestation of the facts as perceptual objects is dependent on the imposition of a hierarchy of value. And so that tangles the damn narrative into it again. But there's something that's key to the idea of parallel hierarchies that I think is a conceptual way out of this.
And that's one of the key moves in Neoplatonism. Exactly what you're puzzling over. How do these things, what explains their parallel, and what explains beyond the parallel? What I was trying to do with the stereoscopic, what explains their convergence?
Okay. So, what if it is something like, let's say I'm using the word person, but let's use the word consciousness.
Okay.
Right. Or so St. Maximus has, this is why I like St. Maximus so much, right? Because St. Maximus, he has exactly what you're talking about in terms of this nomological order, this hierarchy of order.
And he has a sense in which the laboratory for that is man, right? Man with a capital M. And so doesn't it kind of, one of the solutions to this, wouldn't it be this relevance realization that you're talking about? But the relevance realization
ultimately happens in consciousness, or something like consciousness,
I think it happens in intelligence, because we have a lot of relevance realization going on below consciousness.
Okay.
You and I have talked about this.
Right. Okay.
I think consciousness is a kind of intelligence for specific kinds of problems, ill-defined, novel, complexity.
That's the horizon, unpredictable horizon of the future.
Right. So, but let's say, and I think the issue is, and what I'm sort of proposing is, intelligibility is something like the way reality is realizing itself, and relevance realization is intelligence. And the good is the fact that we trust that the intelligence can track the intelligibility. And by doing that, it puts us in touch with the world. That's what I would say.
Is that a presupposition of faith? Is that a presupposition of the faith that was necessary before the manifestation of a real science?
Yes.
The willingness to act on that basis?
I think if you do not, okay, so I'm not going to deny the importance of the Judeo Christian story. Okay. But I would also say that without Plato's argument about the good as the ongoing fulfillment of the promise that intelligibility tracks realness, you can't do science. And there's a reason why the scientific revolution is a return to Plato. Galileo rejects Aristotle and goes to Plato and says, Plato is right. Mathematics, listen to the words, mathematics is the language of reality. There's no math in Aristotelian science for 1200 years. He turns to Plato, and that's what brings in the core of modern science.
Why is that a turn to Plato particularly?
It's because Plato, in the Republic, Plato makes the argument that he had it over the academy. You can't come into the academy unless you can do mathematics, because until you do mathematics, you can't grasp the kind of intelligibility needed to get at the deepest realities of things. And science.
So you thought that math was the cardinal example of that.
Yes. Right.
And all of our science is dependent on mathematics.
Right. And his attitude towards myth and narrative is, right, that's Heidegger's claim about science. Yeah. Is that myths and narratives are, right, that they are indispensable, but they do not have the same degree of revelation of the promise of the good that math does. I'm not saying I'm agreeing with that.
But isn't that why also Neoplatonism could never land, right? It could never land and become a mode of being for a society. It's as if, that's why we've talked about this before a little bit, where what Christianity does is it provides the body for that which was good of the Neoplatonic tradition,
and it provides something more
to be embodied in a communion of love and a communion of participation.
See, what you can't get in Neoplatonism, and although I'm not a Christian, I prefer Christian Neoplatonism over pagan Neoplatonism, because Plato is striving towards the agape, and Christianity makes this astonishing. The two identity claims, both made by John. God is the Logos and God is agape, right? And then that's an identity claim between Logos and agape, right? It's not to say they're the same, but it's also the same, right? And you're going to say the Trinity, and I get that, right? That's fine. And I don't object to that. But the point I'm making is, for me, that's the crucial move. Now, here's what I say in response to that. And this is what I mean when I say about Neoplatonism is the
interesting that you would use the word crucial in that concept.
Yeah, no, I think it is. Because I go back to my point. You can't follow the Logos unless agape takes you out of egocentrism.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. But also agape can't unfold to you unless there's an order and an intelligibility to it. Yeah. It makes no sense to say, I love something and there's no intelligibility to it. That doesn't make any sense. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, but you see, the thing is, and this is what I'm trying to get at with my idea of the intellectual Silk Road, right? That right now, our culture, the hermeneutics of suspicion, we're locked into the courtroom of debate. I propose that we go back and do what we had with the Silk Road, which is the courtyard of discussion. Neoplatonism has this terrific ability to enter into reciprocal reconstruction with Christianity. Clearly. It does it with Islam.
Which is what we're doing right now.
Yes. But it does it with Islam, and that's how you get Sufism. It does it with science. If you take a look, read John Spencer's book, The Eternal Law. If you look at what's happening around Einstein and that, they're all invoking Neoplatonic or similar ideas to Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism with Galileo, it's capable of entering into reciprocal reconstruction with science, with Islam, with Christianity. There seems to be evidence that it can do this with Buddhism, Taoism. That's what Thomas Plant is arguing was happening on the Silk Road. So what you see as a potential defect, I see as a benefit, which is it doesn't land because it's designed to land in many different ways and allow people.
Okay. So that's very much related to this idea of a parallel hierarchy. If you're abstracting out the set of universal facts, then those facts are useful in relationship to the higher order narratives that unite narratives.
But that's exactly.
Which is, I think that's the claim you just made.
I think so. Let me see. So what I'm saying is that Neoplatonism gives us a way to dispose the furniture of thought that we can come into deep dialogue, and it would allow a Sufi and it would allow, a Christian to have deep discussion. They don't have to agree. The Silk Road wasn't dependent on one person running the Silk Road. It was dependent on the fact that all of these civilizations found a way to deeply talk to each other.
Why the Silk Road metaphor? I'm too historically, I know what the Silk Road was, but why use that?
Because the Silk Road binds the East and the West together, literally.
I see.
Right?
It's like the golden thread.
Yes, it's the through line between civilizations, literally. Okay. But not just the physical road. There is a philosophical Silk Road, and Thomas Plant, by the way, who is a Christian, argues that was Neoplatonism. So I think in one deep sense,
science. It certainly is the case that to some degree, if science is a derivation of Neoplatonism in the way that you described, science has also been a uniting methodology and system of apprehension, because many different cultures are willing, with different degrees of ability, to utilize the scientific method.
I agree. And I would say that's ultimately exactly for the reasons you just gave, because science has sort of made implicit within itself many Neoplatonic moves.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I would say, I mean, it doesn't bother me so much in the sense that, to the extent that which Neoplatonism presents as true, I don't have that much of a problem. When I read St. Maximus, I don't even ask myself, Neoplatonism, or is this Christianity?
And I'm not saying you should.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is,
and when I read a Sufi, I don't ask myself that question either. Like if I read Ibn Arabi, I would say, yeah, he's saying some pretty powerful, true things, and I can also recognize the place to which we disagree, but he says some definitely powerful things about the nature of reality, which are
they think about the imaginal without Ibn Arabi. You won't get it. And if you want to turn to some very good places to talk about agapic love, read some of the Sufi. You want, right? Like, I want to.
So you're emphasizing this in large part because, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but because you also see, I think that belief in the logos is a precondition for dialogue, right?
Yes.
But you're making a case for, in some sense, it's not a binary definition of logos. It's one that's informed, perhaps properly, in equal parts from the tradition of Greece and
it's bipolar.
Yeah. But there's also, there's no reason to assume that there isn't a deeper unity that both are pointing to. I mean, we've been acting out that presupposition in some sense in the West since the time of the Renaissance, because that was Rome and Greece meeting Jerusalem in a real sense. Rome and Athens, say, meeting Jerusalem in a real sense.
But it was true way before that. I mean, one of the precursors to the Renaissance is the intellectual reality of Constantinople. Like Neoplatonism was just was present there the whole time. It just was there. And so we don't know much about it because the city was destroyed and everything got scattered. But the let's say the tradition of Neoplatonism, the manner in which one of the important manners in which it reached the West was through these Christian scholars that got chased away from the city basically because it was in danger, and brought the text and the tradition to.
And then there's another.
And then there's the one through Spain.
It comes through the Arab world too. There's sort of multiple times. See, what I'm trying to do, what I'm proposing is, I'm trying to do like a historical thing where I'm trying to look at all of the ways in which it's like the glass. We can get the multi-aspectuality of Neoplatonism by seeing all the ways it was able to reciprocally reconstruct itself, reciprocally reconstruct with Aristotle or with Christianity or with science or with Islam.
Right. So you're taking snapshots of that in some sense, in the same way I'm trying to do that with the notion of what's at the top in the narrative sense, using the biblical corpus.
Exactly. And I'm trying to find the through line, the historical through line for Neoplatonism, because and this is maybe where Jonathan and I disagree, but I think we do it in at least a loving manner.
Or don't understand each other fully. Which
it's
is
possible.
Certainly.
It's possible. But I guess what I wanted to state is your metagame. Me participating in the dialogue is more important to me than continuing the right relationship is more valuable to me than coming to the right conclusion.
Right, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
So I just wanted to state that.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to end, I think. I mean, we got a long ways through this. We'll try to figure out, perhaps, after we think about this for a good while, what we might do to continue it, because there's a few propositions here that I think are relevant. I just might share them with people that we didn't get to. Any hierarchy that is unified is made so by the dominion of a superordinate principle. So something has to bring everything together and has to be at the top to unite. That principle is most effectively what is common to all that is deemed of comparative or relative value within the hierarchy. So we talked about the commonality between the good, the beautiful, and the true. The common principle of value must necessarily be elevated to the highest place in the hierarchy. Well, that's the abstraction of the good. Maybe it wouldn't matter if it was Neoplatonic or the more Christian notion of the logos. And then this is something that you really influenced me in relationship. That bringing to the highest place is personal subordination. So that's above me and I serve it. Imitation, I want to become that. Faith, I believe that that principle prevails. Celebration, which is it's worthy of, what would you say? There's joy in relationship to the recognition of its superordinate place. Adulation, a variant of that, and worship, which is sort of maybe, a worship is what combines all of those. And so those are propositions which I would like to unpack with you guys. And then there's something that's more specifically Judeo Christian after that, which I won't get into now because I think it would be a distraction. So, well.
That was quite a conversation. I'll come to Toronto anytime for this.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we should think about doing it again. We'll start halfway through and see if we can get to the end.
I think that would be very good.
Yeah. Well, it's really, really, see, a lot of what we're doing is we're differentiating the propositions, right? It's like, yes. Well, here's the proposition. Here's its complexity. And there's some real utility in just seeing the full complexity, walking through it.
I mean, this is also, right? This is also, I think, a genuine act of fellowship or even friendship, because the more you do that, the more responsive you can make your argument to people who want to engage with it.
Of course. That's exactly, I mean, we're trying to get to a diverse range of tools that are grounded on something as rock solid as we can manage.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks for
then we don't need a
Yes,
hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. That was
hey, my pleasure,
helpful.
man. I'm so glad you guys could come and that we could be together finally in person. And I think the conversation was a lot more dynamic and deeper than we would have managed on Zoom.
Totally.
Yeah,
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
All right. Great. Thanks, Eric. Thank you for all you who are watching and listening, and more to follow on many fronts with any luck.